Chapter 353. When the Federation did not find any enemies in the vast universe, the army was just a dispensable existence for this society. However, with the sudden appearance of the Empire in the Night Scorpion Nebula, everything changed. The voice of the military was unprecedentedly powerful within the Federation. Especially with the appearance of the war god in Philadelphia, the Federation soldiers were generally welcomed and respected by the people and the society. The military strength of the Federation expanded like a balloon. In just a few decades, the military was crazily expanded. Because of the rapid expansion, the organization and military ranks were somewhat chaotic. But no matter how chaotic it was, the 2 bars and 2 stars on the shoulders of this officer still shocked and astonished the guests of the Lufeng Slope Club. There was only one major general in the Federation military, Du Shaoqing. The rest of the division generals were all colonels. However, the officer on the terrace was obviously only about 20 years old. How could he be a lieutenant colonel at such a young age? The people who were qualified to attend the banquet all had their own information channels. After a brief moment of absent-mindedness, they immediately reacted. There were only 2 such young lieutenant colonels in the Federation. One of them was Li Feng, and the other was Su Lu. The former was the grandson of the Federation's war god, Li Pifu. According to many information channels, the latter seemed to have an unclear relationship with the old man in Philadelphia. According to the political system of the Federation, Mr. Xian, the chairman of the Ethics Committee of the Parliament, was undoubtedly a real big shot who could be ranked in the top 20. But at this moment, when Su Lu said this, the old senator suddenly felt depressed and could not say anything. 2 years ago, Li Feng broke into Parliament Hill and beat up the people in Senator Xian's office. Senator Xian had always remembered the scene that made him extremely angry. Li Feng was not a real lunatic, so he naturally did not dare to be rough with him. However, he beat up several of Senator Xian's aides and secretaries. No media dared to report this incident. Who would have thought that it would become a story of Li Feng beating up a senator? Looking at Su Lu, Councilman Xian was not as calm as he appeared to be. The appearance of Lunatic Li in Feiqing City had already made him lose face. This Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu was not known as a lunatic, but a big shot like him naturally knew what this person had done. The terrace did not become absolutely silent. Everyone looked at Su Lu under the light with complicated expressions. There were whispers behind the crowd. This is Su Lu who broke the Iron 7th Division. I heard that even Li Feng was defeated by him. I don't know what his relationship is with the people in Philadelphia. Nan Mingxiu noticed the strange gazes of the people around him, but did not hear the whispers. He just angrily guessed the background of the young officer standing in front of Zhang Xiaoming. He actually dared to talk back to the old senator with one sentence. But looking at Zhang Xiaoming standing quietly behind Su Lu, the gloominess on his face became more and more obvious. In the hall behind the terrace, under the cover of an evergreen plant, Li Shizhu quietly looked at the disturbance not far away. A trace of complicated emotions flashed across his handsome and charming face. No one knew if he was thinking of the stories related to the presidential election in the past 2 years. Beside him, Lin Dohai glared fiercely at Su Lu on the terrace and said, "You don't want to go out?" From the first time he saw Su Lu in Harbor City, to the nightclub next to Capital University, and then to the Flowing Wind Slope Club last winter, every time the heir of the Lin family saw Su Lu, he would be unlucky and lose face. Last year, at this door, he was even smashed in the nose by Su Lu with a wine glass. As the heir of one of the 7 families of the Federation, Lin Dohai could never imagine that there would be someone in the world who dared to disrespect and even insult him, let alone a small figure like Su Lu. However, at that time, Su Lu had the wife of the back mountain of Macho behind him. Now, that wife might have abandoned him, but in the end, he climbed up the mountain of the Lees of Philadelphia. There were very few people the Lin family did not dare to provoke, but the two families of the back mountain of Macho and the Lake of Philadelphia were existences they absolutely did not want to provoke. Every time he thought of this, Lin Do-hai could not help but hate Su Li's bullshit luck. At this time, seeing that this person seemed to have offended Representative Zien and the people of Green Dragon Mountain, he could not help but feel schadenfreude and was ready to do something. What are we going out for? Li Shuzhu held a wine glass and looked at the crowd on the terrace, laughing self-deprecatingly. Few of the thousands of generations of descendants like them were as stupid as Lin Do-hai, who did not know how to write the word low-key, and could not even see the general situation clearly. The second-generation descendants of the 7 families could not possibly like, and even somewhat despise, Nan Mingxiu, the son of the leader of Green Dragon Mountain. At this time, standing beside Nan Mingxiu on the terrace were some playboys. Madman Li only hit a representative, but Su Lu dared to kill a representative. The difference is too big. Li Shuzhu said with slight mockery, Representative Zien is probably thinking about where to find a way out of this situation. Representative Zien was a big shot. He was standing too high, so it was difficult for him to find a suitable way out of this situation. He was not a guest from Green Dragon Mountain like Nan Mingxiu, who could play the crude and direct role of a revolutionary from time to time, and he could not just leave like that. Therefore, even though he knew that the young lieutenant colonel in front of him was a person that the old man had carefully cultivated, after a moment of silence, he still scolded him in a displeased tone like an elder. What is the occasion today? Why do you have a conflict with a guest who has come from afar? Su Lu narrowed his eyes slightly. Since the big shot did not throw that hat at him, he naturally wanted to wait for him to answer, and then gradually resolve this matter. The shrewdness of a politician was fully displayed at this moment. I was chatting with a friend, and then someone suddenly rushed over to disturb us. That is the whole thing. Su Lu replied. Since he had recognized the old man as a distant relative in the military prison of Qingqing, he had enough background and confidence in the Federation. However, he also knew that if a real big shot like Representative Zien was willing to make some concessions at this moment, and he still wanted to be aggressive, the old man would probably not agree. Representative Zien's expression slightly relaxed, and he slightly nodded. When he was about to say something, Nan Mingxiu unexpectedly interrupted him gloomily. Friend? I only saw you harassing the female soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain. Councilman Zien's expression didn't change, but his mood sank. His second sentence had already been smoothed out and softened without leaving a trace. Lieutenant Colonel Su in front of him also gave a very polite response. Seeing that he was about to build a high staircase and then leave quietly, who would have thought that this stupid leader's son would actually add an extremely inappropriate sentence at this moment? I think this should be a misunderstanding. This is a matter between young people. If we talk it out, we will let it go. Mr. Representative, I am late. Please introduce Chairman Jean to me. Just as the atmosphere on the balcony was weird, and everyone was silent and uneasy, a clear and gentle voice suddenly sounded from the side door. The crowd separated, revealing a young woman behind. This young woman had soft eyebrows and gave people a feeling of friendliness. However, her occasionally moving eyes revealed a sense of pride that made people unable to resist too much. A person who could speak at this time and place was naturally not a small figure. Su Li's pupils slightly shrank, and he recognized that this young woman was Mrs. Zhong, whom he had not seen for many years. Mrs. Zhong looked at Su Lu and nodded with a smile. Councillor Zien smiled and left with Madame Zhong. With her status, she could move extremely high stone steps with just a few words. This experienced and steady counselor would naturally not stand on this balcony and feel the chill and uneasiness in the wind. Looking at the back of the representative who was walking away, Nan Mingxiu was slightly stunned, feeling that she had been neglected, scorned, and humiliated. When she was about to speak, the middle-aged man beside her, who was wearing a pair of traditional Chinese clothes, suddenly leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her gloomy face slightly stiffened, but she forced herself to hold it back. A part of the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain was to be transferred to the West Woods to fight, and that lady was the wife of that tiger. Moreover, the Zhong family in the West Woods was the only family with military power among the 7 families. That tiger was sometimes unwilling to give face even to the president, let alone Green Dragon Mountain. Although Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son, was used to being arrogant, he also knew that the lady was someone who could not be offended. However, the gloominess and anger in his heart became deeper because of the departure of Representative Xian. He looked at Zhang Xiaomeng behind Su Lo and said coldly, "Comrade Zhang Xiaomeng, I think you need to explain the relationship between you and this Federation officer." Although the reconciliation of the Federation was a foregone conclusion, Zhang Xiaomeng, who was known as the Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain, had a complicated relationship with a Federation officer. How would the organization view Zhang Xiaomeng? How would she live in Green Dragon Mountain in the future? Who knew how much insidiousness and viciousness was hidden in Nan Mingxiu's question? Su Li's eyes suddenly narrowed. He felt that his hair was about to stand up, and his fists hanging by his side slowly clenched. "Secretary Nan, please understand your position." Zhang Xiaomeng, who had been silent all this time, walked to Su Li's side and said calmly, "I belong to the 4 departments. First, I am not under your jurisdiction. Second, my rank is higher than yours. Why should I explain it to you?" Previously, Zhang Xiaomeng had been quietly watching the play on the terrace. The reason why she did not open her mouth to explain was because she believed that Su Lo could solve this problem. She was willing to let Su Lo solve this problem, and some of the information that Su Lo had shown made her feel happy, comforted, and even a little proud of him. However, Nan Mingxiu's insidious question made her very angry. She did not want Su Lo to be held accountable by the federal military for beating up the leader's son, so she calmly stood up. The current her was no longer the her of the past. Any of her calm rhetorical questions made Nan Mingxiu's expression become even uglier. Nan Mingxiu did not have any specific position in Green Dragon Mountain. Right now, he was Chairman Jin Jifan's secretary in name. However, he was the most beloved son of the leader of Southern Water, so he often shamelessly called himself the spokesperson of the organization. Zhang Xiaomeng's calm rhetorical questions actually made it impossible for him to step down. Zhang Xiaomeng calmly looked at the people on the terrace, and then she raised her head to look at Su Lo. She smiled slightly and said, "But I don't want you to misunderstand him. In fact, it was I who came to the terrace to find him. He is my ex-boyfriend." Su Lo looked at Nan Mingxiu's stunned face, and endless loathing grew in his heart. He quietly added, "Ex-boyfriend can also be said to be an old lover. We are old lovers reminiscing, what does that have to do with you?" Chapter 354. What does it have to do with you? It's none of your damn business. The entire sentence was said normally, without a single curse word. Obviously, hidden in his words were the sharp thoughts of a young male animal instinctively having when looking at the gentleness he once had. There was even a hint of indecency in it. However, it carried a biting cold force that was as spicy as a scallion. It was done in one breath, incisively, and there was not a trace of pettiness in it. Ex-girlfriend, old lover. In short, I am close to her. The rest of the people on the balcony are superfluous. You guys came to my territory to disturb me. Why should I restrain myself from being presumptuous and make myself unhappy? In the training base, Su dared to force Du Shaoqing to not flip out. After that long conversation, he actually had an indescribable air of a military camp. He had a bit more in common with the tiger of the West Woods, whom he had never met before. This time, most of the people on the balcony were playboys, successful people who watched coldly from the sidelines. They were tens of thousands of light years away from Du Shaoqing, this kind of iron-blooded teacher. Su Li's words burst out with a resounding clang. How could the people watching the show still have the face to look? Those who recognized his identity and background and wanted to get close to him would have to find another time. In an instant, the crowd was blown away by the rain and wind. Only a handful of people remained. Even the playboys left the balcony somewhat unwillingly but not daring to stay. Nan Mingxiu stood in the middle of the balcony with a gloomy face. What Zhang Xiaomeng said earlier was tantamount to a slap in his face. Su Li's following words directly slapped him to the ground. As the most beloved son of the leader of Green Dragon Mountain, when had he ever been humiliated like this? Although Nan Mingxiu knew that the lieutenant colonel in front of him definitely had a great background, he was still a person who was used to being unruly in Green Dragon Mountain. He was unwilling to leave in shame. In that mountain, there was no charter or law, only the regulations of the Central Committee and the voice of some uncles as the basis for doing things. Speaking of which, although Nan Mingxiu was arrogant and was considered an idiot by both Shi Qinghai and Zhang Xiaomeng, he was not completely brainless. Therefore, he decided to find a suitable way to leave here. In the future, he would think of a way to kindly educate Zhang Xiaomeng, who had a somewhat weak revolutionary will, and severely punish Su Lu, who was a lackey of the Federation's shameless leader. Having made up his mind and decided to leave, Nan Mingxiu was so angry that he laughed. He was about to say something and leave, but who knew that Su Lu saw his smile and added, "You also know that you are ridiculous." Before he could put on the demeanor of a leader's son, Su Li's seemingly mild but actually sharp words blocked him back. Nan Mingxiu only felt that his chest was tight, and he was about to lose control of his anger. He angrily raised his head, pointed at Su Li's nose and said, "Are all the officers of the Federation?" Su Lu still did not let him finish the sentence. He said, "The last person who pointed at my nose had his finger broken like a crisp radish." This was true. In a certain coffee shop in Harbor City, a certain nutshell manager arranged by the Tai family had once pointed at Su Li's nose with contempt. In the end, Secretary Bai had gently gripped his finger and fiercely broke it. There was a saying that killing too many people gave off a murderous aura. This saying was not true, but people who had seen a lot of life and death would naturally be able to see bones as pillows and living people as corpses. They would be able to swallow thousands of miles away like a hungry tiger, and their mind would be as calm as the bright moon and the great river. They would be able to see everything lightly, and they would naturally be fearless and frightening. After escaping from Donglin for 3 years, Su Lu had experienced so many things. Although he was still far from reaching this state, there was always a trace of such a feeling in his bones. What's more, what he said was true, so it wasn't a verbal threat used by rich playboys to win a battle. It was filled with a sense of certainty and reality. If he said he would break your finger might really break in the next moment. Nan Mingxiu grew up in Green Dragon Mountain, but she had never had the opportunity to see the rain of bullets, the real battlefield of Chiqua. She stared blankly at Su Lu, listened to his indifferent words, and felt the slightly cold calmness that made one's heart palpitate. Unexpectedly, her heart subconsciously shrank, her body trembled, and she put down her arm. Frightened by his words, she put down her hand. The leader's face was burning hot, as if he had been slapped 3 times. His facial features were even somewhat twisted with anger. This face was not very good-looking, so Su Lu did not look at it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the figures of Li Shuzhu and Lin Dohai behind the window. He said to him, "Do you think those aristocratic children are really willing to get close to you? No, they have never really looked up to you. In the past few years, their families desperately wanted your father to die, but now they have become your friends. Don't you think this is a very absurd thing?" He narrowed his eyes slightly and took a deep breath of the autumn night air. The cool and refreshing air was very comfortable. Apart from the flash of memories of Secretary Bai in his mind, the complicated emotions that had arisen from his reunion with Zhang Xiaoming finally cleared up a lot because of venting. Humiliating people you hate is perhaps the best way to get a good mood. At this time, Su Lu thought of what Shi Qinghai had said at the banquet. He vaguely understood that if one was not afraid of people, then naturally one could be at ease. This was related to one's status in society, to one's strength, and most closely related to one's temperament. No longer paying attention to the other people on the terrace, Su Lu looked at Zhang Xiaoming and said calmly, "If there is trouble in the future, you know how to find me." Zhang Xiaoming made a sound of agreement through her nose. Her soft and gentle voice became a little sour in the night wind. She took his military cap from the stone railing. Su Lu slightly paused and lowered his head. She carefully tidied his sideburns and made sure that every strand of hair was caught in the brim of the cap and would not be messy. Only then did she put down her hands with satisfaction. The two of them stood very close to each other in this position. They could smell each other's breath. They were not strangers, but they were not familiar either. However, they were very close. Su Lu quietly let her do this, and then slightly opened his arms. Zhang Xiaoming took a step forward, hugged him, and gently leaned on his chest without saying anything. He carefully kissed the girl's smooth forehead, then turned and left the terrace. There were other people on the terrace, but Su Lu and Zhang Xiaoming didn't see anyone else. They naturally hugged and said goodbye. Zhang Xiaoming didn't even look at Nan Mingxiu's gloomy face. She just narrowed her eyes like a young man and looked at his back as he walked away. A slightly bitter smile appeared on her lips. In her heart, she softly answered the question that Su Lu didn't have a chance to ask. "In my heart, of course you are the most important part." A young man with no background can now make Madame Zhong come out to protect him. He can make Senator Xian not want to be too harsh. Li Shuzhu looked at Su Lu, who disappeared at the entrance of the stairs, and said quietly, "From the Tai family to the Li family, how can he be appreciated by so many people?" Of course, it's not as simple as luck. Lin Daohai was about to refute, but he noticed that young Master Li seemed to be reflecting and analyzing something, not asking for his opinion. The so-called big shots in the Federation respect his background, but fear his methods. Methods are not the methods to kill people, but other things, including his ruthlessness. This kind of person who doesn't follow the rules, like your brother, will only give countless people headaches. The problem is that your brother's surname is Lin, so the elders have to show tolerance and kindness, but what about him? Lin Daohai's expression changed. Li Shuzhu continued, "I heard that His Excellency the President also admires him. Speaking of which, who doesn't want to have a genius mechanic who can make MX and has such terrifying combat power? But last year, you said here that as long as someone like Su Lu enters the Federation system, he will no longer be a threat because he has to follow the rules." Lin Daohai didn't agree with Li Shuzhu's opinion. But the problem is that the old man who brought him into the Federation system is himself the biggest rule of the Federation. Li Shuzhu hid the trace of ridicule in his eyes. The Li and Lin families had been good friends for generations, and he didn't want to humiliate Lin Daohai too much. He just thought that the Lin family had a person like Lin Banshan, but how could they have such an idiot like Lin Daohai? Could it be that the Lin family, other than the distant Lin Yuanhu, had been taken away by that broken door? People with guns speak louder. That tiger in the West Woods is like that, and that old man is even more so. He can control the most guns, and his voice in the Federation is the loudest. As long as he doesn't die, he still thinks highly of Su Lu. This Federation, including our family, can only watch this small-eyed man climb up step by step. Li Shuzhu said with some regret that in a remote corner of the mountain forest of the Flowing Wind Slope Club, the automatic dishwasher was making a low humming sound. This place was dirty and filthy, and the overflowing foam formed a sharp contrast with the grand hall that was not far away. Of course, those important guests naturally wouldn't appear in this place. An old dishwasher with white hair and a face full of traces of suffering withdrew his gaze from the terrace. It was completely different from his aura. He shook his head like a poet and said with emotion, "People say that it's always good to have a lover who is old. The most important thing is that you can't forget your first love. The story between your friend and my student really makes me, an old man with a heart of stone, feel sad and unbearable." Shi Qinghai was bored to death with a cigarette in his mouth. He squatted beside him and vaguely cursed a few vulgarities. He wasn't surprised at all that this intelligence leader of the anti-government army didn't appear at the banquet, but in this shabby place. Even if the Green Dragon Mountain and the government had fully reconciled, the anti-government army still had to leave some power to protect themselves. "I saw your first love, your old lover, in that S2 nightclub. That's Sister Ko," he said sarcastically. "Don't think that I don't know anything. I'm warning you, don't even think about pushing Zhang Xiaomeng back to Su Li's side. Even though she's your favorite student now, in my eyes, she's still that stupid, naive student who can't accomplish anything." This legendary intelligence leader looked at Shi Qinghai with a smile and said, "Xiaomeng has been with me for 2 years, and she has improved a lot. I'm going to recommend her to take over my position." Shi Qinghai's hand froze. He didn't hold the cigarette, and the red but fell into the foamy sewage. Chapter 355. Are you joking? Shi Qinghai was no longer smiling. His beautiful eyes had a trace of seriousness. He said, "How old is she? How many years has she been in the mountain? What qualifications does she have? Do you think the committee will agree to your recommendation? I think those old guys will think you are crazy. I'm not asking her to join the Central Committee. There was no record of this person in the Federation. Even the Green Dragon Mountain only referred to him as a legend. It seemed that he could disguise himself as any person he wished. He had once claimed to be a mountain person, but the Tai family's crown prince had still managed to find out the name that was closest to the truth, Mr. Zhong Kai. Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, "The position of the standing committee is vacant. Who will replace me? This is something that the Central Committee needs to consider. As for the position of the chairman of the Internal Affairs Committee, I'm sure Brother Nan Shui has his own ideas. What I want to do is to let Xiao Meng become the section chief of Section 4. Shi Qinghai sighed softly. After hearing this explanation, his mood calmed down a lot. Otherwise, he wouldn't feel at ease handing over the intelligence network of the organization to that stupid woman. However, I've spent a few decades building the network within the Federation. I plan to hand it over to her. Of course, this will be done in secret." As if guessing what Shi Qinghai was thinking, Mr. Zhong Kai smiled faintly and added another sentence. Shi Qinghai was about to take out his cigarette case and light up a second cigarette when he heard this. He angrily threw the cigarette case in his hand to the ground and said in a low voice, "Are you crazy? Do you want all the fish in the sea to die?" The anti-government army was able to hold on in Green Dragon Mountain for so many years largely because of the intelligence network that this man had built. No one knew how many people within the Federation government were secretly helping him. Shi Qinghai and his teacher should be the most successful branch of this network. However, even he only knew that this intelligence network was a vast ocean. He was only a bubble within it. Yet, this man actually said that he wanted to hand over this life and death ocean to that woman. First, she has no professional training. Second, she is stupid. Third, she is a woman. Shi Qinghai's face was gloomy. He didn't expect to hear such bad news when he met with the organization today. He didn't hold back. Don't think that you can look down on all the women in the world just because you got the daughter of the Minister of Defense pregnant. Mr. Zhong Kai picked up a towel and wiped his hands. He smiled and said, "Women are more delicate than men. I've taught her for 2 years, He Hao. I think you know your friend's personality very well." Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, "If something really happened to Zhang Xiaomeng and she was facing death, even if Su Lu was in the West Woods, I think he would still come back to save her." Shi Qinghai fell silent. After thinking carefully, he knew that his judgment was correct. In his eyes, if Zhang Xiaomeng was a woman as stupid as a donkey, then Su Lu was undoubtedly a man who was calm and intelligent to the extreme. However, once he was impulsive, he would also turn into a donkey. His eyes gradually became cold. He looked at the empty balcony in the distance and thought of the previous scene. He said coldly, "She knows your arrangement. Is that why she met with Su Lu?" No. You are insulting the 2 beautiful words of old lover and first love." Mr. Zhong Kai stared at Shi Qinghai angrily. "There is another important reason for choosing Zhang Xiaomeng, because I trust her." The old man's voice suddenly became light. He looked at Shi Qinghai and said, "In fact, I also trust you. But how can you be at ease with this kind of work? So, I have arranged something else for you. Of course, if you are willing to take over my position, I will not hesitate to change my original idea." "What are you doing?" he asked. "Only a dog would do it," Shi Qinghai replied. "Even if you don't do it, someone will do it, right?" he said with a hint of vicissitudes. "Help her more in the future." Shi Qinghai was silent. He asked, "What kind of work did you arrange for me?" "You know, I have just been pardoned. Who knows how many people in the Federation are watching me? You will go to the West Woods." He said slowly, "The agreement between the mountain and the government is being implemented one by one. Although I trust President Pabre more, he is still a politician. There are shadows of his wife and many influential people behind him. The troops in the mountain will be transferred to the West Woods to resist the Empire. Whether the equipment promised by the Federation government can be implemented, and whether the promise to not mix in with the sand can be implemented, you need to investigate, see, and report back. I heard that there was a job called inspecting the army during the dynasty." Shi Qinghai pursed his thin lips and said self-deprecatingly, "Although I have harmed many good families, I don't need to suffer like this." Mr. Zhong Kai smiled and said, "I think because of what happened 2 years ago, President Pabre should have an impression of you. So, it will be easy for the government to accept you as the liaison officer. In addition to your relationship with Su Lu, you will have an innate advantage in the West Woods." Shi Qinghai was silent for a long time. He nodded and didn't bargain. He just looked at the old man with a complicated expression. Then, he walked down the steps, picked up the cigarette box from the pool of dirty water, and painstakingly found 2 cigarettes that weren't wet. He lit one for himself and respectfully lit one for the old man. Mr. Zhong Kai took a deep puff of the cigarette and was very satisfied. He said with a smile, "You only smoke number 37 cigarettes. As a spy, this is also a loophole. To be an excellent spy, you can't have a hobby that others know about. When I entered this profession, I stopped smoking and drinking. Of course, I can smoke and drink at the same time." These words were a bit difficult to understand, but a professional like Shi Qinghai could easily understand. The old man turned his head and looked gently at Shi Qinghai. "Your teacher was one of the first people I developed in the Federation. I didn't expect you to grow up so quickly. Now that we are old, the future depends on you." After saying this, he handed over a cold little tool and said, "This thing is very useful. The instructions to use it are embedded in the screen. I've already done the information separation. When you open it for the first time, all you need to do is imprint your fingerprint on it." Shi Qinghai took the item with the cigarette in his mouth and put it in his pocket. Looking at the man's thin body, for some reason, he felt that the man's body overlapped with his teacher's fat body. His heart ached, and he could no longer suppress the question in his heart. He asked calmly, "Today, you seem to be making arrangements for your death. What exactly happened in the mountains? Could it be that those old bastards have started a purge again? But Nanshui has always trusted you. You've been sitting peacefully in the wind for so many years. Could it be that something has happened this time? You're thinking too much. The mountains are no longer the mountains of many years ago. The only time you entered the mountains for training was when you encountered the last purge. No wonder you've always had a shadow in your heart." Mr. Zhong Kai smiled gently and explained, "Furthermore, even if there are some internal conflicts, those of us who have survived must always persist in doing some right things. Just like this time when the Empire invaded. As a part of humanity, of course we have to contribute. But how to strike the enemy and protect ourselves in the cruel war is another difficult problem. Who knows whether or not the government forces will shoot us in the back. We have to leave behind a spark for the cause of justice. We can't let the Federation treat us like a dish delivered to the bastards of the Empire, and this is your mission in the West Woods." "I'm asking you what's wrong," Shi Qinghai asked. "We can't retire in this line of work. Since I'm preparing to hand over my shift, naturally I'm going to die." He smiled as if he was talking about someone else. He looked at Shi Qinghai and said seriously, "Lung cancer, advanced stage 3. Shi Qinghai's movements froze. He slowly removed the cigarette from his lips. He wanted to remove the cigarette from the mouth of the person beside him, but in the end, he didn't move. "You old dog, you're finally going to become a dead dog," Mr. Shi said with a smile, but there was a hint of sadness in his laughter. The intelligence network of the anti-government forces was like an ocean. He always thought that this boss, whose name he never knew, was a silver shark. Perhaps he would die bloody on a sharp hook, but he would never die of old age and quietly sink into the white sand at the bottom of the sea. How could such a legendary figure die for such a vulgar reason? He didn't want to believe this, but he had to. After a long silence, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Since you're going to die anyway, can you tell me your name?" "Oh, you can call me Shi Qinghai," the old man said seriously. A moment later, beside the dishwasher, the two men by the sewage started laughing at the same time. After leaving the balcony, Su Lo was quietly led to a remote room. In the room, he saw the quiet young woman standing in front of the oil painting, quietly admiring it. His mood suddenly calmed down. Someone who could influence the Ministry of Defense to order him to attend the banquet naturally wanted to see him. At this moment, this question was answered without asking, but Su Lo understood why Mrs. Zhong in the West Woods chose the Lufeng Slope Club and did it so secretly. "I know your question." Mrs. Zhong turned her head and smiled at Su Lo. "Last year, you gave me a difficult problem. Snatching someone under the nose of Macho in the back of the mountain. It's not that easy." In an instant, a hint of pride appeared on the quiet young woman's face. "Of course, in Bermuda and the West Woods, the Zhong family has the ability. The problem is that the entire Federation is under the indifferent gaze of Lady Tai. In Bermuda and the West Woods, the Zhong family can cover the sky with one hand, but in the capital, I can't do it. For the past few months, you've been asking me where the person is. In fact, he's always been in my hands, but I can't give him to you because I don't want that lady to find out that I'm involved in this matter." Mrs. Zhong looked at Su Lo with a grave expression and said, "Even if she may have already guessed, I don't want her to get the evidence." Chapter 356. When I finished updating the last chapter, I said that it was the best chapter of the day, and it was indeed so. A few days ago, I was looking at the things I wrote before. I always thought that this was the only way to improve. It could be considered a certain level of self-reflection. But in the end, I came to a conclusion that made me somewhat wrong. Starting from Ing Xiao, to the Vermilion Bird, to Qing Yunian, to Spy, the first half was always just passable. No, it should be said that it gave me a headache. Of course, the later half would always be written much better. What I mean by better is compared to my own writing. For every story, I wrote better at the latter half than at the beginning. Every day, I wrote better at the latter half than at the beginning. Perhaps I didn't understand this before, but when I think about it carefully, it's a very normal thing. Because I'm a terrible person who needs to feel to write a story, I can't write smoothly if I don't get into the topic at the beginning. Every day, I have to get into the mood to write smoothly. When I feel good, I can really write 3,000 words per hour. Without a doubt, I even reached the peak of 3,600 words per hour. Of course, that required editing. And this kind of speed is like the climax of a story. It's always a flash of brilliance, and not a long-term happiness. I've been writing for 6 years, and there aren't many times when I feel like going crazy. Most of the time, I'm still like today's first chapter, writing 1,000 words per hour, suffering unbearably. Saying this makes it seem like I'm serious about writing, but in fact, my serious attitude towards writing can only be considered sloppy. It's far worse than many people. How many scenes are there that are unbearable to look at? Sometimes, when I look back, I feel like my face is burning. Of course, there are also many scenes that are very cool. I'm very proud of myself when I look at them, but overall, I can barely maintain a level that's worth the 2 cents or 3 cents per 1,000 words that everyone spent on subscriptions. There's nothing to be proud of. Yesterday, when I saw Fire Beacon's chapter, I was very moved. I still insist that Ergo is the most awesome book this year. Whether or not it's pretentious or not, this book is the most awesome, and there's no other. In the past, I used to dislike top-class gongzi the most, so sometimes I feel like this world is too strange. Damn, it's the same person, but why does his level increase so much? Is it that my eyes are dazzled? Therefore, this was the effect of the great killing weapon, seriousness. In the past, many people said that my writing was good, but I never responded. Now that I'm serious, it's all bullshit. Words have to be concise, elegant when they should be, crisp when they should be crisp. That's what makes good writing. How can an old woman's foot binding be any better? Of course, there were some good sentences in the foot binding cloth. It was just that I had a hard time picking them out myself. You should know that many of my friends have very wisely expressed their disgust towards those messy long sentences that pretend to be profound. I wholeheartedly agree, but a leopard cannot change its spots. A leopard cannot change its spots. Bah, I admit my mistake, but it will be difficult to change it in the next 2 years. Everyone, bear with it for now. The chapters in which I seriously believe my writing is good, and the ones in which I admit to having worked hard, are the ones that are concise. For example, there are a few chapters in Spy. There are also a few chapters that don't count as sour, and Fan Xian's first murder in the year of celebration. But not much, because it was easy to slip as one wrote. Slipping had its advantages, but there were more disadvantages. The problem was that when one did not slip, it would be very difficult to write. Of course, I was going crazy. How could it be of course? Of course, my favorite was still my nonsense. These few days were the transition chapters. They seemed peaceful and smooth, but in reality, they were written with a lot of heart. Furthermore, I updated 3 chapters in 3 consecutive days. I was very proud of my diligence. Thinking about it carefully, it was because I put pressure on myself and told myself to put more effort into it. The first half of Zhou Xingxing's Bastard was able to say such big nonsense, big truths, and big truths. As a storyteller, I have to remember this even more. When there is nothing else to do in life, my job is to make stories for everyone to read. So I have to put pressure on myself and put effort into it. When there is something to do, I write less. Presumably, you people who are used to my laziness would not bear to hit my face. Bear to. Even if you bear to, don't hit me. Although I am not someone who relies on my face to make a living, there are still days when I have to welcome guests. I do not plan on unbanning this nonsense chapter at will like in the past. I will leave it until the end as a form of motivation and requirement for myself. I was indeed a little tired from writing the past 2 days. There was nothing about being unconventional or unconventional. In the future, if anyone dares to say that my writing is good, I will drag them down and beat them to death. Believe in Brother Chun, continue. Chapter 357. 3 years ago, he had met this young woman at the airport. At that time, this lady had a gentle smile and kind eyes. Although she naturally showed a natural pride and nobility, because of a very insignificant matter, she had condescended to wait for him, who was wearing thin clothes, to give her a Westwoods military windbreaker and a small card. 3 years later, after only a few phone calls and then meeting again, the eyes that should have been unfamiliar became familiar because of that very enchanting sense of intimacy. So Su-lo was a little touched. He had always thought that taking care of little Watermelon on the spaceship escaping from Donglin was a small matter. It was not easy for the head of the Westwoods Zhong family to treat a small person like him like this. This kind attitude made him remember it to this day. His dark-colored Shili military windbreaker had long since been riddled with holes during the assassination incident at Linhai Gymnasium. However, he had kept that incomparably old card, which in the end played the role of a great killing weapon. You mean? Lady Tai is still not willing to let go. Su-lo looked at Madame Zhong under the oil painting and asked, puzzled. Probably other than Lin Banshan and that little lunatic of the Li family, no one in the Federation knows what the old man and Lady Tai talked about that day in Linyuan. Madame Zhong sat on the sofa, her hands gently placed in front of her stomach. She looked at Su-lo with a smile and said, but this is a matter of face. Since you can come out of Qingqing safely, it means that Imo Cho has made concessions in front of the old man. You have the old man's face, so your safety won't be a big problem. Besides, Madame won't do this kind of thing. After all, with her status and tactics, it would be undignified for her to deal with you. Su-lo understood why Westwoods was so vigilant and even played a little trick of entering the tiger's den since Lady Tai wouldn't deal with him for the time being. But we, the Westwoods, have interfered in this matter. Even if Lady Tai didn't do anything and just watched coldly from the sidelines, if she had the evidence, and found out that the Westwoods had spoiled her plans, it would mean that my husband and I owe her an explanation and a favor. We from the Westwoods don't want to owe her a favor. Madame Zhong smiled slightly. Her smile seemed somewhat helpless as she said, the favor between the 7 great families is too great. We can't easily owe them. For the Zhong family in the Westwoods, the annual budget review by the parliament at the beginning of spring was the most troublesome thing. The Westwoods region, which had been through many wars, required the Federation Management Committee to review the aid budget and energy quota. The Tiger of the Westwoods and his wife never cared about ordinary favors or explanations in society. However, Lady Tai, who lived in seclusion among the mountains and lakes, could influence many people in the parliament with just a wave of her sleeves. For the Zhong family, this kind of favor was too big and a headache. Su-lo understood this sentence and couldn't help but fall silent. He had only made a phone call to the Zhong family in the Westwoods, whom he didn't know and had no relationship with, but they had helped him so much and caused so much trouble. He was in the middle of it, so even if he wanted to make up for it, it seemed that he couldn't do much. I owe you and Commander Zhong a big favor. He was not used to speaking in such a tone of authority in the Federation, but just like in the past, as long as he said something, he would definitely admit it. This was what it meant to be true to one's word. Madame Zhong had studied Su Li's file more than once, so she knew the true nature of this young man. She understood that although this sentence seemed normal, it actually carried some weight. She couldn't help but smile and say, "I don't think there's a chance for you to return this favor." Su Li's cheeks were slightly hot. He knew that Madame Zhong was not mocking him, but stating a fact. The only family in the Federation with military power among the 7,000 generations of the Federation's 7 great families might have some scruples in the capital ring, but in the West Woods, they were like local tyrants or separatist warlords. No matter what kind of trouble such a family encountered, they did not seem to need his help to solve it. If they encountered trouble that they could not solve, he would have no ability to help. "I'm very grateful for your willingness to help me, although I don't really understand the specific reason." He looked at Madame Zhong sincerely. Madame Zhong looked at him calmly. After a moment of silence, she replied, "Not all help has a hidden purpose. Although I am very optimistic about your future in the army, before you went to assassinate Macklin, there was no such future, and there was no need for investment. So, this is not an investment." Su Li listened quietly. Madame Zhong smiled and sighed softly. Her amiable and warm face glowed faintly. She said slowly, "Many people are in awe of the old man behind you, although no one, including me, knows the real relationship between you and the old man. But even more people are afraid of your methods. I think that little old man from the iron calculator family would definitely not dare to face you alone, because the mentality you have shown is too dangerous." Su Li thought to himself in a self-deprecating manner. He was not a cold-blooded killer. But there are also many people who like you, such as the president. Madame Zhong smiled and said, "Including my tiger, so you don't have to feel any psychological pressure." Su Li thought of the things he had heard before. When President Pobre decided to pardon him, he had encountered countless resistance. But Commander Zhong, who had always been at odds with President Pobre in the West Woods, stood on the president's side and supported the pardon. Thinking of this, his gratitude to the Zhong family in the West Woods grew stronger. He did not know what to say, so he bowed seriously to express his gratitude. "Fireworks and I are now living in Shisha State. The New Year's Eve holiday is coming soon. If you have time, you are welcome to be a guest," Madame Zhong said with a smile. Su Li was slightly stunned. The image of a little girl wearing a white dress and holding a doll bathed in the starlight naturally appeared in his mind. He had not seen her for 3 years. He did not know how the little girl who did not like to eat and liked to skip home had grown. The black car drove steadily and silently away from the Windy Slope Club like a ghost. This was a car specially made by the Tai family. The security personnel in the club already knew that this black car with a license plate had been given to a friend by the family's crown prince, so they did not check it carefully. Behind them, 2 dark green military vehicles were following them at a distance. Su Li narrowed his eyes and glanced through the rear view screen. He felt a little strange, but he did not order them to leave. After all, he was not sure if Lady Tai was willing to give up. With these brave experts following them, the safety of the 2 of them was more guaranteed. Nominally, it was a holiday, but after leaving the training base, the 7th Combat Group of Whitewater Company did not disband. Instead, they were divided into 2 groups and followed Su Li closely, like special agents of the Special Task Force to protect important people. Su Li was not used to this arrangement. He thought, the 7th Combat Group is going to be Jian Shueier's bodyguard soon. Why are these people protecting me? However, he understood that this should be an order from the Ministry of National Defense, or even the old man in Feiqing City. Even if he wanted to get rid of these people, it would be very difficult. In addition, during the training base and the exercise, he gradually got along well with more than a dozen men of the 7th Combat Group. Everyone deliberately avoided the knife he stabbed by Yulan at the wedding, so they were somewhat used to each other's existence. The black car drove past Hawking Avenue and went around to the second highway out of the city. Lan Xiaolong, who was in the military vehicle behind them, reported, "Everything is normal, no one is following us." Su Lo narrowed his eyes slightly. It seemed that Ma Chou finally admitted the current situation. At this time, he did not need to worry that Lady Tai would find evidence of the involvement of the Zhong family in the West Woods. Thinking of this, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. A trace of absolute joy appeared on his face, and he said, "I told you, who would care about small people like us? Brother Wei, your courage has become too small. Those people in the military vehicle are all your men. They look like real soldiers. You are not a small person now." Accompanied by an unusually complicated voice, a pale and thin young man sat in the passenger seat. He looked at the radar system in front of him with a somewhat uneasy expression. He carefully touched the interior of the car, shook his head and sighed, "I haven't seen you for 3 years. It seems that you are doing well in the capital ring. Just now, the lady took me to the club. When I was at my best in the East Woods, I have never seen such a lively place." Su Lu turned his head and glanced at him. He found that his best friend had become a lot calmer than before because of the year in prison. Only the haggard and tired face that did not fit his age was still the same. 3 years ago, Li Wei was the leader of the orphan gang in the East Woods region's Heshi district. Every night, he would fight for territory with the taser made by Su Lo with the other poor people. He would compete with the other poor people and yearn for those glamorous nightclub girls. 3 years ago, Su Lo was just an apprentice in a repair shop. Using the craftsmanship that his uncle taught him, he helped Li Wei make weapons that were suitable for him. At the same time, he patiently advised Li Wei to be careful, be kind to others, and not kill too many people. When the two of them met again 3 years later, many things had changed. The black car stopped next to a rice cake stall in the Wangdu district. After Su Lo and Li Wei got off the car, they walked to the stall and asked for some snacks. Then, they sat down at a small table on the sidewalk. 2 dark green military vehicles were parked not far away. The men of Group 7 did not get off the car. Instead, they vigilantly observed the surroundings. The 2 friends, who had not seen each other for a long time, met again. They did not know what to say to break the silence. After all, the 2 of them had experienced too many things, especially Su Lo. Li Wei looked at his ordinary face and the 2 military vehicles behind him with a complicated gaze. Although he did not know what Su Lo was doing, he could feel that Su Lo had put a lot of distance between them. Chapter 358. The autumn wind blew the fallen leaves on the street. It was already late at night, and the streets of Wangdu were unusually quiet and chilly. The dim light from the rice cake stall was particularly warm in such an atmosphere. The stall owner lowered his head and hid the meat skewers under a plastic sheet. He looked around cautiously, hoping that the HTD bureau wouldn't find trouble with him in such a cold and quiet night. There were 3 tables on the sidewalk, but only 2 customers. Not far away, there were 2 dark green military vehicles parked. The owner of the rice cake stall couldn't recognize the license plates of the 2 military vehicles, but he could guess that these 2 young customers must have some background. In this day and age, rich people who were used to eating exotic delicacies always liked to come to the streets to try something different. The middle-aged owner didn't find it strange, and he wasn't nervous. Even if the 2 young customers didn't order the black market mutton skewers that he treasured the most, he didn't secretly criticize the rich for being stingy. This was because he could see that these 2 young people were true friends. "I don't think I'm that awesome, maybe. I'm just lucky. After escaping from Donglin, I somehow met some big shots. Oh right, I'm working in the army now, but my file should still be with Nutshell. Sulu lowered his head and nibbled on the spicy rice cake as he explained softly. His life was too strange, and there were many things that he couldn't explain to Li Wei. Moreover, the story of the past 3 years was too long. Even if he wanted to tell it, he didn't know where to start. Want a bottle of wine? Sulu asked for Li Wei's opinion. 3 years of hard liquor seemed to be the only way to fish out all the unnecessary worries of the young people. Li Wei nodded. He used his chopsticks to pick up a few pieces of roasted celery and put them into his mouth. He chewed with a poochie-poochie sound, as if there was a very heavy matter in his heart and he didn't know where to start. Sulu filled the wine glass in front of him and himself, but didn't touch the chopsticks in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and stared at the celery and bean rolls covered in soy sauce on the plate. He seemed to be thinking about how to start the conversation, and he also seemed to have a heavy heart. They had finally reunited with their childhood friends who had not seen each other for a long time. Furthermore, there did not seem to be any danger around them in the Federation. They should have been shouting and hugging each other, but for some reason, it had become so strange. After a long silence, Li Wei picked up the glass of wine and gulped it down. He pursed his lips and asked, "After I was released from prison, I went to Fragrant Orchid Avenue to take a look. That repair shop had been converted into a protein meat distribution station. I thought you were dead, but last year, I was brought back from Bermuda. That's when I found out that you were still alive. I want to ask you a question. Is the repair shop owner dead?" "Yes." Sulu slowly finished the wine in the cup and found that this transparent liquid was much more spicy than the amber liquor he usually drank. It stung his nose a little and made it difficult for him to breathe. He had great confidence in the uncle who had a carefree appearance but a cold heart. In the end, he was moved to tears by the uncle's death. After all, the uncle was the most wanted criminal in the Federation. How could he die so easily? However, 3 years had passed and there was no news of the uncle at all. Coupled with the fact that he had witnessed the white beam of light from the battleship's main cannon, he could only gradually admit that someone had left forever in the depths of his heart. Li Wei's expression became more gloomy. Like Sulu, he had been living helplessly in the underworld. He had never had the opportunity to see the scenery of the upper class and taste the world of the big shots. Therefore, although he had some wisdom and perseverance, he still hadn't learned how to hide his emotions. "I have something to tell you." Almost at the same time, Sulu and Li Wei put down their glasses and said the same sentence. The two of them looked at each other. After being stunned for a while, Sulu spoke first. He looked at Li Wei's face and said seriously and apologetically, "Because of that taser, you were in prison for a year, and then you were kidnapped to Bermuda." He didn't finish his sentence because Li Wei was staring at him with a strange look. He scratched his head and couldn't help but smile bitterly. "What's wrong?" Sulu asked. Li Wei smiled bitterly and said, "Do you know what I want to say? I want to ask for your forgiveness. After all, that taser was stolen from my hands. It's all my fault that the government targeted the repair shop owner and put you on the wanted list. After I was released from prison, it was you who sent me that 1 million, right?" Li Wei looked at Suli's face and said emotionally, "I was kidnapped by those big shots and taken to Bermuda. In the end, it was you who saved me, right?" "I've always felt sorry for you," Sulu murmured. Li Wei murmured, "I think so too." The heavy silence after the reunion was actually just because these two friends grew up together. They both felt a strong sense of guilt towards each other. This sense of guilt was intertwined between the two of them. Now that it was exposed, it blew a strong sense of warmth on this cold autumn night. The two of them looked at each other for a long time and then burst out laughing at the same time. It was just like many years ago on the sidewalk of the Clock Tower Street, watching the TV screen through the glass of the pub. Two orphans were holding their bellies and laughing at the plot of the family comedy that wasn't funny at all. Their eyes once lit up because of the cute little girl who played the role of the orphan. However, at that time, they weren't old enough and didn't have the money to buy wine. Now, it was different. "Boss, give us a few bottles of wine. Do you want those people in the car to come down and drink with us? Are those people really your subordinates? Who knows? Don't tell me, I still have a little bit of status in the army. 2 years ago, you sent me $1 million. Do you know what I used it for? I bribed Bao Longtao from the 2nd Division. It only took them 6 months to gather the troops and occupy 3 blocks, 3,000 kilometers away from the capital special district. The autumn atmosphere in the capital of Xixia state wasn't too strong. With his lieutenant colonel military ID, Su Lu took a free supersonic plane and arrived at this large state famous for its autumn red leaves. He took the address left by Mrs. Zhong and got into a taxi. Looking at the autumn trees outside the window that had just started to change color, but didn't have time to turn red. Instead, they looked a little messy. He thought of many things from the past. The Federation's New Year's Autumn Festival had a long history. Whether it was to use lively parades to get rid of the desolation of autumn or to give housewives a chance to do some spring cleaning, no one could say for sure. Today, the place Su Lu was going to was in the suburbs of the state capital, so the taxi wasn't stopped by those parades. The reason why he specifically chose this day to accept Mrs. Zhong's invitation during his short vacation was because he owed her a huge favor. Also, he really missed that little girl. At the beginning of his life as a fugitive, he and that little girl could really be said to have depended on each other for survival. That kind of feeling was probably something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. In the past, Su Lu would never have any contact with the Westwoods Zhong family. He had kept that card in his pocket for so long and never used it. Firstly, it was because the special forces under the Westwoods Tiger, such as Colonel Lake, had seen his face before. If he were to come into contact with them, it was very likely that his true identity as a wanted criminal of the Federation would be exposed. Secondly, although it was a military order, Uncle Feng Yu had died under the main cannon of the Westwoods battleship. As a student, even if he didn't avenge him, it was impossible for him to be close to the other party. But now, because of that old man and his strange relationship with the glory of the Charter, Su Lu no longer had to worry about his identity as a fugitive of the Federation. As for the uncle's death, after a night of drinking with Li Wei, he unknowingly became a lot calmer. Therefore, he left Li Wei's safety to the men of Group 7, and quietly got rid of them and came to Xixia. This was a large house in the suburbs. As a giant company of the Federation, the place where the chairman and daughter of the Gu Zhong company lived was a little strange. The fact that the residence of the Group 7 was not a manor had already made Su Lu feel a little strange. A polite and respectful female housekeeper welcomed Su Lu into the first floor of the mansion. Su Lu saw Mrs. Zhong standing behind the door, and before she could say anything, she heard a deep, lazy, and even a little shameless voice. "Third young man is here." What kind of realm does a voice have to be able to make people hear shamelessness? Su Lu turned his head in shock and saw a fat, round face. This face had 2 slightly squinted eyes, looking harmless, but occasionally a cold light would pass through the narrow eyes, making people feel that this person was extremely dangerous. Su Lu had been kicked by this person before and had always remembered it in his heart. He deliberately imitated and learned, turning that fierce kick into his own killing technique. Naturally, he didn't forget the danger of this person. With a bitter face, he greeted, "Hello, Captain Tian." "Not good." Fatty Tian looked at him with incomparable pain and said, "You lied to me. That year on the ship, you refused to fight me with your real skills, making me think that you weren't a cultivation genius. Otherwise, I would have been the first person in the Federation to know about your relationship with the Lee family. Sulu only felt his whole body go numb and couldn't answer. Fortunately, Mrs. Zhong shouted, "Damn fatty. Don't make such a disgusting face, the fireworks are coming." Fatty Tian's whole body trembled, and he immediately straightened his chest and raised his head. With a solemn face, he actually put on the demeanor of a person like Du Shaoqing. Sulu didn't have time to appreciate this fierce person's ability to change his face. He raised his head and looked towards the stairs, and at a glance, he saw the little girl jumping down. The little girl was wearing a white tutu dress, and her cute red little shoes made a crisp sound on the stairs. Her knee-length light-colored socks and the light flower pinned on top of her head complemented each other beautifully. Especially her black hair, which was extremely neatly cut back in the past. Her picturesque bangs followed her movements and mischievously swayed up and down. It really looked like a piece of watermelon skin. Of course, it was the very cute kind. At the villa's New Year's Eve festival, only the four of them ate. After seeing the little watermelon, Su Li's warm mood gradually became somewhat inexplicable as the silence at the dining table became silent. From the beginning until now, the 8-year-old Zhong Yanhua didn't even look at him directly. No matter how Mrs. Zhong smiled and talked about what happened on the ancient bell, the little girl still looked indifferent and proud. She was only willing to treat Su Lu at the dining table as a strange guest. After all, she was just a child. How could she remember the journey like an adult? He comforted himself, but he still felt a little lost in his heart. How could the reunion between brother Su Lu and the little watermelon be so silent? Chapter 359. Huiyan, didn't you always say that you wanted to see big brother Su Lu? At the dining table, Mrs. Zhong looked at her daughter gently and said softly. She was very puzzled by her daughter's silence today. Although in these 2 years she had rarely heard the words, "Big brother Su Lu," from her daughter's mouth, even if it was just normal etiquette for entertaining guests, she shouldn't be so impolite. Yes. Zhong Huiyan held the long chopsticks in her small hands and worked hard to scoop up the fragrant rice in the bowl. Her cute and straight little nose made a sound, but she still didn't pay attention to the somewhat awkward Su Lu across the table. Mrs. Zhong looked helplessly at Su Lu and smiled apologetically. She had no choice but to let her daughter do as she pleased. After all, they were adults and wouldn't take this matter seriously, so she naturally changed the topic. When Fatty Tian ate, he had a delicate feeling that was completely opposite to his body shape. He chewed slowly, took gently, and put gently. His fingers gently brushed the tableware on the table as if he was brushing orchids. He drank a mouthful of red wine and put down the wine glass. He smiled and patted Su Lu on the shoulder and said, "I heard that you taught Du Shaoqing a lesson." Military exercise." Su Lu wasn't used to the other party's direct enthusiasm, so he answered hesitantly. "I mean on the field. When that kid was about to go crazy, you stopped him." Fatty Tian smiled and said loudly, "Very good, I admire you very much." Su Lu was speechless. He thought that he had used his outburst to suppress Du Shaoqing. Speaking of which, he had learned from the tiger in the West Woods. "But it's a pity that you weren't direct enough. You should learn from me. More than 10 years ago, I directly beat this ice demon into an ice demon pig." Fatty Tian thought of the past and sighed with pride. When Su Lu heard the terms ice demon and pig demon, and thought of Du Shaoqing's solemn image as a role model military officer, he finally forgot about little watermelon's cold disregard that made him sad, and almost laughed out loud. From the corner of his eyes, he glanced at the round hand on his shoulder, which was like a fat steamed bun, and the cute fat fingers like mutated orchids. His smile turned into a faint fear. If this fatty Tian went crazy, that teacher Du would really suffer a lot. And the result? You were locked up in a small dark room for 3 months, and your military rank was suspended. When you retired, you could only be a colonel. Mrs. Zhong thought of the past and couldn't help but shake her head with a bitter smile. Her cheeks were stained with unnatural complex emotions. Listening to these heroic people's fierce deeds, Sulu suddenly thought of the tiger in the West Woods that suppressed Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division for many years. Fatty Tian's actions back then might have had something to do with it. Everyone knew that the relationship between the Zhong family and Du Shaoqing was extremely bad. He made Du Shaoqing suffer in the maneuver. Could it be because of this that Commander Zhong in the West Woods had an inexplicable appreciation for him? Just as he was thinking about this, the middle-aged housekeeper who led Su Lo into the villa came over. At this time, the dishes had been served, so of course there was another reason for her appearance. Mrs. Zhong quietly listened to a few words, took off the napkin, stood up, and greeted Su Lo. Then she walked into the attached office on the first floor. Today is the New Year's Day, so it's probably a call from the boss. Fatty Tian explained with a smile, but there was a flash of doubt between his eyebrows. If it was a family call, logically speaking, his sister-in-law should have brought Hui Yan along with her. Su Lo couldn't think of this. In his opinion, Commander Zhong was guarding the front line for the Federation. Because of the continuous conflicts with the Empire, he couldn't reunite with his family. It was normal for him to call his family on this festive day. He just remembered that today was the New Year's Day, and it was very rare for Mrs. Zhong to invite him to be a guest. Who knew that not long after, the door of the side office opened, and Fatty Tian also left the dining room. It seemed that Commander Zhong had something to say to him. At this time, only Su Lo and Zhong Huiyan were left in the dining room. If it had been before he entered the villa, Su Lo would have resisted being alone with the little girl. He didn't hate or fear children. Besides, he was most familiar with the Zhong family in the West Woods, and the one he missed the most was Little Watermelon. The main reason for coming to the New Year's Day banquet today was to see her and ask her if she was doing well in the past few years, how her studies were going, and if she still didn't like to eat like before. However, the silent resistance during the meal and the undisguised indifference and pride on the face of the little daughter of the Zhong family made Su Lo feel a little uncomfortable and sad. Although he could comfort himself that she was just a child after all, this huge gap between his self-perception and reality still made him feel awkward and lost. There was silence at the dining table. Su Lo didn't know what to say to the little girl across the table. He felt a little funny and sad. In the absolute silence, it was as if he was sulking with an 8-year-old girl. So he had to lower his head and concentrate on the delicious food on his plate. He used a silver knife to cut the medium-rare wild beef, but he thought of 3 years ago on the ancient Bell spaceship. He had once boasted shamelessly to Little Watermelon that he would take her to eat real meat in the future. Suddenly, Su Lo felt as if someone was looking at him. The mysterious power in his body had already made him sensitive to the aura around him. He slowly stopped moving the silver knife in his hand and raised his head vigilantly. Then he saw Zhong Huiyan's pair of clear eyes that were extremely serious. On that cute and delicate face, there was no longer the indifference that she deliberately put on just now. There was only the curiosity of a little girl, and that pair of eyes that were getting bigger and bigger. Su Li's small eyes couldn't help but widen. He didn't know why Little Watermelon was looking at him like that. The two of them didn't speak. They just stared at each other inexplicably on both sides of the quiet dining table. It seemed that they would continue to stare like that. Suddenly, a trace of a child's cute and crafty look flashed in Zhong Huiyan's extremely clear eyes. It seemed that it took a very long time for the little girl to connect the young military officer across the table with the somewhat blurred but exceptionally friendly face from 3 years ago. Or perhaps she had already confirmed who the person across the table was and was just pretending. But in short, she was indifferent until now. Only then did the little girl smile sweetly and call out softly, "Brother Su-lo." Her voice was very clear and crisp, like the dew on a little white flower that had just bloomed in the field, moistening the tender throat. This was a form of address that he hadn't heard for a long time. Accompanied by the clear and moving voice of a child, it touched Su-li's eardrums and also touched his heart. He looked at the little girl across the table in astonishment. He looked at her straight black hair that swayed gently mischievously. It was as if he had returned to 3 years ago. In the simple cabin of the spaceship, he was still using a towel to wash this little girl's hair. His expression was dazed, and he didn't react for a moment. "Brother Su-lo." Zhong Huiyen cutely wrinkled her brows and called out again very seriously. Su-lo finally reacted. Although he didn't understand why little Watermelon was pretending to be a stranger to him, when he heard her call him Brother Weiss, his prematurely aged heart immediately softened. He chuckled and narrowed his eyes into crescent moons, just like the 2 eyebrows in the night sky of S1. "Take me out of here." Zhong Huiyen looked at him seriously across the dining table. She pursed her lips hard, acting cute and determined. When the two of them met under the starlight, the little girl blurted out, "Protect me." Su-lo stared blankly at the little girl across the table. He roughly understood why little Watermelon was so indifferent to him in front of Mrs. Zhong and Uncle Tian. She didn't have a trace of enthusiasm at all, as if she had completely forgotten what had happened in the past. Almighty Creator, 3 years had passed, and this child was already 8 years old. Could it be that she still hadn't gotten rid of the bad habit of leaving home? No matter how thick the nerves in Su-li's body were, it was difficult for him to resist this sudden impact. He was able to communicate with the glory of the charter. His brain, which had put down countless structural blueprints, buzzed and was about to explode. With a crisp bang, he simply fell under the table. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Zhong and Fatty Tian ended the call with West Woods and walked out of the office with solemn expressions, just in time to see this scene. The elders came to the scene. Little Zhong Huiyen returned to her indifferent and proud expression. She gently scooped up the thick soup in front of her like a rude daughter of a rich family. "Nothing." Su-lo couldn't bear to expose little Watermelon's plan of leaving home and let her be scolded. But in fact, at this time, his mood was much better than before. At least he knew that little Watermelon hadn't forgotten about him, and she still trusted him as much as before. She even trusted him to handle such a big matter. Of course, Su-lo wouldn't leave home with little Watermelon. He just quietly shook his head helplessly at the little girl when Mrs. Zhong wasn't paying attention. Then he left his private contact information on the internet. Zhong Huiyen sat on the sofa with a cold and listless face. After saying a few words to her mother, she went upstairs. But before she entered the house, she turned around and glared at Su-lo. But the anger of a little girl was extremely cute no matter how one looked at it. When Mrs. Zhong sent Su-lo out of the door, she said a few words apologetically. After a moment of silence, she said, "I just received news that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have decided that Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division will enter the West Woods." Su-lo was shocked. Only now did he know the real content of the previous call. The taxi was parked on the side of the villa. Su-lo declined Mrs. Zhong's offer in advance to send him to the villa. After saying goodbye, he sat in the passenger seat. Thinking of little Watermelon's cute appearance at the dining table, Su-lo couldn't help but smile bitterly. He couldn't understand why little Watermelon always wanted to leave her family at such a young age. Although Commander Zhong was rarely with his daughter, it was obvious that Mrs. Zhong was a very good mother. Maybe it was because she was lonely. Su-lo looked at the mottled autumn leaves outside the window. He thought of Tai Zhuan in H1 District and Zhou Yu. The children of aristocratic families didn't have good lives. He thought that if he could come back alive from the front line in the future, he would spend more time with this child. At this moment, he heard some noise in the back seat. He looked back warily and saw that the chair in the back row had been pushed over. A little girl wearing a blue student uniform was crawling out with a face full of dust. Zhong Huiyan struggled to climb into the seat and sat down. She looked at Su Lo in front of her and giggled. She said, "Brother Su Lo, I'm here." Su Li's expression froze. This clear childish voice sounded like thunder in his ears. Chapter 360. Su Lo blinked his eyes with great difficulty to confirm that the little girl in the blue student uniform in the back was a real person and not an existence of his imagination. When he reacted immediately, he shouted to the driver next to him, "Stop the car. Go back." Hearing this, little Watermelon widened her big, innocent eyes and looked at her big brother Su Lo in confusion. She thought to herself, "Just now, you insisted on not taking the family car and had the taxi wait downstairs. Wasn't it so that I could jump down from upstairs so that I could escape?" In the little girl's mind, she didn't run away from home alone, but had a perfect cooperation with brother Su Lo. When the little girl saw that Su Li's expression was serious and not lively, she finally understood that the car was about to turn back. She tightly hugged the somewhat old doll in her arms and screamed, "No!" With a sharp screech, the taxi abruptly stopped on the flat highway of Shisha State. The taxi driver, who had received a generous tip, stood in the woods beside the road and smoked a cigarette. He looked at the squirrel, who was busily preparing winter food, and occasionally whistled. Although he didn't understand the relationship between the young officer in the car and the little girl, he wasn't worried because the young officer didn't look like a shameless person who would abduct and sell a girl. Moreover, someone who could sit as a guest in that big house wouldn't lack this small amount of money. In the taxi, Su Li's expression was calm and gentle, but his heart had already been shocked into countless turbulent waves. He painfully rubbed his hair and said to the little girl as calmly as possible, "Where did you get the idea that I would run away from home with you? You also thought that I called for this taxi specifically to cooperate with you." Zhong Huiyan hugged the doll and looked at him with a cute frown. She said, "Isn't this always shown on TV?" Su Lo looked at her delicate face and the dust on her student uniform. His heart couldn't help but soften. Unable to say anything harsh, he took out his handkerchief and carefully wiped away the dust. Thinking that this little girl was actually able to climb down from the top floor of the villa, he couldn't help but feel a burst of fear. He asked, "I really don't know where you learned the ability to climb over walls at such a young age." Zhong Huiyan widened her eyes and looked at him doubtfully. She said softly, "Brother Su Lo, when we were young, you took me to drill the ventilation pipe on the spaceship. It was much more difficult than climbing down from upstairs." Hearing this, Su Lo was startled. His action of wiping her face froze, and a bitter smile appeared on his face. This little girl not only didn't forget the past, but even remembered these details so clearly. "But when you were young. Are you an adult now?" Thinking of this, he gently rubbed the little girl's hair, just like how he used to do after washing her hair 3 years ago. Zhong Huiyan stubbornly broke her little head away from his palm and carefully smoothed her slightly messy black hair with the palms of her 2 small hands. Her action was very cute. Her lilac-like little mouth was tightly pursed to express her strong dissatisfaction with Su Li's plan to send her home and her anger at the wrong person. In the 3 years since she came to the capital ring, Zhong Huiyan had been well-behaved and lovely. She lived a stable life with her mother and never ran away from home again. In the next 2 years, she even rarely mentioned the story of the past. Mentioning Brother Donglin's name was not because she was forgetful. Mrs. Zhong and the people in the villa had forgotten the past earlier than her because they thought that she was just a child. However, after the environment lost its vigilance, Zhong Huiyan was still quiet and well-behaved. She never tried to run away from home again because although she was young, she was absolutely smart and sensible. She knew that there were still many bad people in the outside world covered by the glory of the charter. The little girl did not have the courage to try anything, until today, when Su Lu came, she finally saw the honest and loyal face that left the most vivid impression in her childhood. She found the most trustworthy brother Su Lu. Therefore, the chick found the courage and thought that she had a tacit understanding with Su Lu. She quietly changed her clothes, climbed downstairs, and got into the car. "You're wrong. Think about how sad your family will be if they can't find you." Su Lu was quick with action and not taciturn with words. However, in front of a stubborn and sad little girl, he did not have the ability to play the role of a mature elder at such a young age. He could only say the boring words of those boring teachers in movies, TV shows, and novels. He spoke carefully. Zhong Huiyan did not reply. The little girl lowered her head slightly and maintained absolute silence. The black hair by her face covered her ears. The clear bangs in front of her forehead just happened to reach her eyebrows. She was using this kind of silent resistance to stubbornness and futility. "I'll come to play with you often in the future, okay?" Su Lu made a promise that even he himself did not believe. This was probably a rare time for him to lie. He was about to lead Team 7 to carry out the security advisory work. Who knew what the federal military was thinking behind the incident of protecting the national idol? Before the situation in the West Woods calmed down, he simply had no time to come to Shisha State again. Zhong Huiyan suddenly raised her head. Her tuft of hair swayed and then fell down peacefully. It was like a little black bird spreading its wings and testing to fly once. "You're lying again." The little girl opened her eyes wide. Her bright eyes, like a shallow lake, were filled with unconcealed childlike grief and anger. She said quickly and angrily in a thin voice, 3 years ago, you said you would take me out to play. When did you come?" Su Lu was stunned. He did not know how to explain. Could he say that he was a wanted criminal of the Federation and that someone under her father knew him? Or, could he tell this little girl, who was still so clean that it made one's heart ache, about his 3 years of experience? For example, how he used a pen to stab an old man's skull, how he kicked a mecha, how his bones were shattered, and the endless darkness. He took out his phone. As he began to press the button, he laughed bitterly and said in a low voice, "I really don't understand you, little girl. The little miss of the West Woods Zhong family. You don't know how many people are envious of you, but in the end, at such a young age, you always want to run outside. The outside world is actually not that fun. I'm not going out to play." Zhong Huiyan opened her eyes wide and stared angrily at Su Li's fingers that were pulling out the phone. Her little hand that was holding the old doll tightly clenched. She quickly said in a shrill voice, "I just want to go out and take a look." "Can't I do that?" "How is that something an 8-year-old child would say?" Su Lu said softly. Hearing the chirping sound coming from the phone, he shook his head. "What's there to see outside? Even if you are determined to be a traveler, you can't go wandering around the world at such a young age. I'll be 9 next month. I'm not a child." Zhong Huiyan looked at Su Lu with disdain. Her dark eyes rolled up, making her look exceptionally smart. "I'm locked behind the metal door every day when I go to school. After class, I'm picked up by Auntie Chiu and those bodyguards. I've never gone out to play with my classmates. I don't even know where my deskmate lives. They invited me to a birthday party, but my mother didn't agree. Last time, my mother finally found a day to accompany me to the amusement park. In the end, there was no one in the amusement park. There was only a Ferris wheel and a wooden horse spinning. She thought that I didn't know anything. How could I not know? The amusement park was closed that day, and it was opened especially for me. What's the point of a one-person amusement park? I'm alone in dance class, piano class, and even baking pie class. I'm alone. Unlike other children, Zhong Huiyin didn't use an aggrieved voice to beg Su Lu to take her away. Instead, like a little adult, she stared seriously and angrily at Su Li's eyes. The words coming out of her small mouth became faster and faster, and her voice became softer and softer. It was almost condensed into a straight line. If a woman spoke in such an angry and exaggerated tone, it would inevitably seem a little neurotic. But when a cute little girl said this, it could only show her cute stubbornness and unwillingness. In the life of a little missy, Zhong Huiyin's curiosity about the outside world grew stronger day by day, but she was increasingly unable to interact with the outside world in a normal way. In everyone's opinion, the little missy of the Zhong family had everything, but little Watermelon didn't think so. She couldn't understand all of this logically, but she could clearly feel from life that if only one person could have everything, it was actually equivalent to having nothing. Mrs. Zhong, yes, she's with me now. I'll send her back right away, Su Lu explained into the phone. I don't know either. She suddenly came out of the back seat just now. Well, okay, it's okay. Mrs. Zhong had just found out that her daughter was missing. Before she had time to start worrying, she received a call from Su Lu. After she relaxed, she couldn't help but feel a little funny. Why did the little girl, who was usually well-behaved and quiet, trust Su Lu so much every time she saw him? Su Lu was on the phone with the villa while watching the little girl's movements from the corner of his eye. After Zhong Huiyin vented her anger and unwillingness, she didn't speak again. She turned her head and looked out of the car window in silence. Her small face reflected in the car window looked very disappointed. Was she alone? Mrs. Zhong's voice on the phone gradually faded. Su Lu looked at the little girl's slightly lonely back and remembered what Tai Yuan had said to him in the gymnasium. At that time, Lady Tai had tried to let Tai Yuan grow up normally in a commoner's school. However, with the sudden assassination, this method of education had come to an end. Among the 7 big families in the Federation, the Tai family and the Westwoods Zhong family only had one person in this generation. Loneliness was one thing, but the danger they were about to face was another. Su Lu understood very well why Mrs. Zhong was so cautious, but looking at Zhong Huiyin's small shoulders, he couldn't help but feel a little emotional about her unusual teenage years. At this moment, it suddenly started to rain in Shisha State. The round raindrops hit the glass window of the taxi and scattered into small umbrellas. The quiet Zhong Huiyin gradually opened her eyes wide and smiled as she watched the changes in the raindrops. Seeing the little girl's expression, Su Li's big heart suddenly softened. After a moment of hesitation, he said very embarrassedly into the phone, "Madam, can I take Huiyin out to play for 2 days?" The little girl obviously heard this sentence, but she still didn't turn around. She just looked at the rain on the glass window and her eyes gradually curved up, looking very cute. Chapter 361. The rain didn't stop, and the cold wind was blowing. Especially on the tarmac of the capital's Dojiao airport, the autumn wind and rain were even more depressing. The cold wind and rain poured into people's sleeves, instantly cooling people's eagerness to return home. The passengers sitting on the self-transit express train looked at the 2 figures walking on the tarmac, one big and one small. They wondered if they wanted to walk back to the building in such cold weather. At first, the passengers thought that they were a father and a daughter, but when they saw the young face of the officer, they had to overturn this conclusion. They couldn't help but feel very strange. The cold autumn rain didn't stop, and the cold wind blew horizontally. In the wind and rain, Sulu held the big black umbrella in his left hand, and held the little daughter of the Zhong family's hand in his right hand. They walked to the side of the tarmac. Because he was worried that the little girl would get wet, he leaned most of the umbrella to the right. The left side of his body was already wet, and the dark green military uniform looked like it was painted with ink. The little girl's left hand tightly held his hand, and her right hand was holding the old doll. She silently followed Sulu and walked forward quickly. Although it was hard, she didn't say anything. Her beautiful long eyelashes fluttered, and her eyes were smiling like crescent moons. Her white socks and black shoes under her little blue dress were running quickly in the shallow pool of water. Only then did she have time to keep up with Su Li's speed. With her broken and laborious footsteps, the little school bag she brought from home jumped up and down, and the neat black hair on the top of her head also jumped up and down. It was just like the child's mood at this time. Sulu finally reacted and slowed down. At the same time, he tilted the black umbrella in her direction. The two of them didn't talk much along the way. They just walked in silence like this. There was a tacit understanding and a wonderful sense of rhythm, just like 3 years ago in the 32nd district of the spaceship. They didn't walk far before Major Lan Xiaolong came down from the black car and welcomed the two of them to the car. He sat in the dark green military vehicle behind them. It was very warm in the black car, and it was completely isolated from the cold rain and autumn wind outside. Sulu took out a towel and warmed it in front of the heater. He then covered Zhong Huashan's little head and rubbed it casually. He wanted to explain the military vehicle behind them and the identity of the men in Group 7, but looking at the little girl's eyes, she didn't seem to be very interested in these things. That's right. Every time the little miss of the Zhong family went out, she would be followed by a group of Special Forces soldiers. A formation like this, to her, was very common. The school bag and the old doll lay quietly in the back seat. Sulu quietly dried little Watermelon's wet hair, but his mind was thinking about something else. A bitter smile appeared on his lips. He didn't know if it was because he was obsessed or because he was shattered by the little girl's expression when she looked at the raindrops outside the window, but he unexpectedly asked Mrs. Zhong on the other end of the phone to take her out for 2 days. What was even more inexplicable was that Mrs. Zhong actually agreed to this absurd and irresponsible request after some consideration. It was important to know that little Watermelon was the only heir of the Zhong family in the West Woods. She had always been under extremely strict care in the capital ring. How could Mrs. Zhong agree to let her leave with Sulu? Are you satisfied now? Sulu threw the white towel in the back seat and looked at the little girl helplessly. Zhong Huiyan's ink-black eyes looked up, as if she was thinking. Then, she nodded vigorously, and the word, yes, came out of her straight and cute little nose. She rubbed her hair vigorously and shook it around with a giggle. She was like a puppy that had just returned home from a rainy day. She was extremely cute. Downstairs at Wangdu Apartments, Sulu carefully instructed the people in the military vehicle, mainly Lan Xiaolong. He wasn't used to the men from Group 7 following him around like bodyguards every day, but today, he was bringing little Watermelon home. It was the first time the little miss of the Zhong family had left her parents' protection to go out and play. If he didn't have such a security expert by her side, he wouldn't be able to rest assured. Even if Mrs. Zhong said on the phone that the security forces to protect the little girl would follow them to the capital. Call Uncle Li, Sulu said to Zhong Huiyan as he pushed open the door of the apartment and pointed at Li Wei on the sofa. Zhong Huiyan glanced at the man on the sofa, nodded, and called, Uncle Li. There wasn't much respect or intimacy in this call of uncle. The little girl's delicate and pretty face had a faint pride and indifference that kept people thousands of miles away. She didn't have the kind of intimacy that Mrs. Zhong had hidden deep in her heart, but she had learned her external expression perfectly. Although she was young, she already had a bit of a noble aura. Li Wei was sitting on the sofa and watching television in boredom. He had a cigarette in his mouth and a wine glass in his hand, looking like a gangster or scum. Suddenly, he saw Su Lo bring home a little girl carved out of ice and jade. He was shocked and quickly brushed away the cigarette ash on his body and asked, "Whose child is this?" "She's really pretty." Su Lo let out a wry laugh. He couldn't possibly tell the truth that this was the little princess of the West Forest region. He shook his head and sighed. "The child of a friend in Shishia wanted to come to the capital to play, so I brought her back." "That's good. This is also my first time in the capital as a country bumpkin. I wanted to ask you to accompany me for a stroll, but I was afraid that you would be busy. Coincidentally, I'm with this little girl." Li Wei suddenly stopped talking because he saw the indifference on this little girl's face. He sensed that she was definitely not a country bumpkin. Zhong Huiyan didn't do what Su Lo thought she would do, run around the various rooms curiously, admiring the simple yet genuine happiness of the lower class of society. Then, she would become intoxicated by it and jump on the sofa while laughing. That was something that little girls in television dramas would do. It was obvious that this little girl didn't have such a boring hobby. She just quietly walked around the living room with a trace of caution and curiosity in her eyes. The little girl's gaze fell on a stack of miniature discs under the television screen. She curiously looked at the discs that looked like coins. She lowered her little head and seriously studied them for a long time. Suddenly, she raised her head and looked at Su Lo and Li Wei. She said in an incomparably serious tone, "This is a pirated version." Su Lo and Li Wei looked at each other and felt endless shame and embarrassment. When they were young, they were orphans in Donglin. Naturally, they had developed the bad habit of buying cheap pirated versions. Now that they were being sternly criticized by an 8 or 9-year-old little girl, they couldn't help but feel their faces heat up. Who knew that Zhong Huiyan would suddenly burst out laughing? The little girl excitedly shrieked, "That's great. I've always heard people say pirated versions, but I've never seen them even once." She hugged the stack of pirated discs and turned around. She said, "Brother Su Lo, I've never seen pirated versions. The Federation TV station doesn't make my favorite all-metal Frenzy discs, so I can only watch replays every time. But that station has too many advertisements." She innocently looked at Su Lo and asked in an incomparably serious tone, "I've heard that pirated versions don't have advertisements. Is that true?" Su Lo opened his mouth wide. After a long time, he cautiously said, "Why don't you take a look at this legendary pirated version?" Little Zhong Huiyan stubbornly and sorrowfully uttered a series of words that broke Su Lo's heart. His fatherly love grew in him, and he resolutely brought Zhong Huiyan back to his home. He had thought that after leaving the villa, the little girl would scream in excitement, cut up the bed sheets and pretend to be a witch to scare people. She would go to the amusement park overnight to play with heartbeats, go to the fast food restaurant to eat junk food, and play games crazily. He had even mentally prepared himself to accompany her to ride the Snow Mountain Dragon. The Snow Mountain Dragon was the longest and most thrilling roller coaster in the universe. However, he had never thought that little girl Zhong Huiyan would just sit quietly on the sofa with a plate of freshly fried potato sticks in her hand. She was obediently watching the TV series on the hologram. No, to be precise, she was watching pirated discs. Whose child is this? She hasn't even seen pirated versions before. Isn't she too pitiful? Li Wei looked at Su Lo, who was tidying up the kitchen, and sighed with emotion. Su Lo didn't dare to look at the little girl in the living room. In fact, he was already dumbfounded. He thought that the upbringing of the 7 great families was too serious. Back then, it was acceptable that Tai Xuan had never eaten scallion pancakes, but he had never seen pirated versions. He had the urge to call the young master and ask if he had ever watched porn before Miss Bai Chi took his virginity. The early autumn festival was only a few days away. Sulu really wanted to make little Watermelon happy, so he naturally couldn't let her stay at home and watch pirated versions every day. After thinking about it, he couldn't think of where to take the little girl to play. Suddenly, he remembered that among his few friends, the woman in red in the Shishan courtyard was already a mother, so he directly dialed a number. "Drag that Dalmatian back and kill him as soon as possible before I call the guards to shoot him." As soon as the call went through, So Yu's voice was extremely cold and angry. It directly made Su Li's ears go numb. He held the phone in shock and took 2 seconds to understand. Dalmatian. She must be talking about that playboy Mr. Sure. He hadn't been seen for more than a day. Could it be that he had run to the Shishan courtyard? Shishan courtyard. An anti-government spy had run to the entrance of the Federal Army's most heavily guarded courtyard. Although the Federation was playing a big game of reconciliation, wasn't sure Qinghai's approach a little too fierce? What's the meaning of him blocking the entrance of the courtyard? He's even calling the Sentinels brothers, putting his arm around their shoulders and exhaling smoke. Sulu, I'm warning you, before those generals come in and out, and before my father comes back, you'd better drag him away and bury him as soon as possible. Otherwise, even if I don't shoot him, there are plenty of people who will. Zhou Yu's voice on the phone was unusually cold, just like the girl in red in front of the nightclub in Linhai. However, Sulu could only hold the phone and frown bitterly, thinking that it was useless for him to persuade that young master. He hesitated and said, "He probably wants to see you or the child. What are you afraid of?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. From the corner of his eye, Sulu saw the little girl in the living room yawning but still staring at the TV screen. He hurriedly told her about the troubles of a certain daughter. Unexpectedly, the daughter of the Zhou family was stunned and simply said, "Get out." This chapter is much more interesting. When I was writing the first chapter, I was listening to Yang Naiwen. In the end, I still couldn't write well because my mood was a bit messy and I was too short on time. During the day, I was busy with work and other chores like buying tickets. Actually, everyone should be able to see that I've been in a really good state these past few days. I'm sorry to inform everyone that I can't maintain this state any longer because tomorrow I'll be leaving Daqing and embarking on a journey. The leader's father, who is also my most respected elder, is hospitalized in Baotou, Inner Mongolia. The two of us will be going to visit him tomorrow and probably won't be back until next Saturday. However, the news we've received is good, so there shouldn't be any major problems. We just don't know how long he'll need to recuperate. I hope he recovers soon. In fact, I've been waiting for her to ask for leave so that she can leave, so I've been working hard these past few days to write more. However, I didn't expect that she'd just changed to a new unit and leave so suddenly that I didn't have a single chapter saved. In the next few days, on the road and in Baotou, I tried my best to make time to write. I've been writing intermittently until today. Ever since I promised to keep updating, I haven't stopped. I'm trying to keep it up, but the most I can write every day is 3,000 words. Perhaps one day I'll reach 2,000 words. Perhaps. I'll really stop updating. Chapter 362. Sulu was very experienced in taking care of pregnant women, and it was not difficult for him to take care of children with his meticulous mind. It was just that when he was on the spaceship, he lived with the little girl in the small cabin and told her a few fairy tales every night. Now that little Watermelon was almost 9 years old, her delicate features had not yet shown the temperament of a young girl, but it could be seen that she would not have much interest in fairy tales anymore. It's really troublesome. Sulu felt that his vacation might be the last one in his life, and it had been messed up by many things. The bad taste of life was vividly reflected in these few days. Starting from Mr. Shi, to Li Wei, and then to little Watermelon, all the people he had not seen for a long time rushed back into his life. Although it was infinitely warm, it was also infinitely busy. When had Wangdu apartment ever been so lively? The most troublesome was still little Watermelon. He leaned against the kitchen door with a cup of coffee in his hand and looked at the little girl on the sofa who could barely lift her eyes. He couldn't help but smile slightly. He didn't know why this little girl always had absolute trust in him. 3 years ago, she was not even 6 years old. After 3 years, how could she still remember him? This kind of trust and the feeling of being remembered was very warm. Su Lo forgot which philosopher had said that being needed was a very deep kind of happiness. But at the same time, this kind of trust and being needed was also a kind of great pressure. In addition to the pressure of Mrs. Zhong's trust in him for no reason, it was like a sharp knife under the soles of his feet. He had to be careful with every step he took. He had to let little Watermelon have a happy vacation and ensure her absolute safety. After being told to get lost by Zhou Yu, he knew that the young mother was extremely angry because of the spotted dog at the gate of the West Woods compound. Naturally, he didn't dare to call again. After thinking about it, he had to let little Watermelon have fun, and it had to be safe and quiet without any danger or disturbance. He really didn't know where to go in the upper class of the Federation, except for Linyuan and Lufeng Slope. But how could those places be suitable for a little girl? He suddenly remembered that he had received a call from Li Xiaotong yesterday. Li Xiaotong looked cold, but in fact, he was quite a good person to befriend. He was a good person to consult, and anyway, he had to meet him before the end of his vacation. A place to play. No problem, the 3D movie washes the holographic screen, the amusement facilities are all there. Seventh young Master Li's faint voice came from the phone. That's good. It's clean, right? How can the place we play be unclean? Li Qishao reprimanded somewhat angrily. Su Lo added seriously, it's for little girls to play with. Li Xiaotong paused for a moment before replying, don't worry. No problem. Under the archaic eaves of the ivy garden, Li Xiaotong put down the phone. In his calm eyes, the usual gloominess had faded a lot, but there were more complicated emotions. He muttered to himself, how young is a little girl? Brother Zhang still stood at the door like a gun tied in a coarse cloth. He knew very well that the young master wasn't asking him a question, but he still took 2 steps forward and prepared to arrange tomorrow's meeting. We won't do anything illegal. We won't touch anyone under the age of 14. Li Qishao instructed. He frowned slightly and said hesitantly, something's not right. Why did Su Lo become such a beast all of a sudden? The arranged place was a theme park. As for what the theme was, Su Lo drove the black car all the way along the cliff to the mountainside, looking at the Ferris wheel and the iron tower near the sea, but he still couldn't figure it out. Beside him, Zhong Huiyan rubbed her slightly dry eyes. She was quite interested in the scenery in the southern suburbs of the capital. After all, she was a little girl. Looking at the mountains full of autumn sunflowers outside the theme park, she was somewhat happy. Li Wei was dozing off in the back seat, but young Master sure didn't follow them. He was sleeping in the Wangdu apartment. This beautiful flower waiter had spent the entire night blocking the entrance of the Shishan compound. He was already extremely tired and naturally didn't want to join this strange group of 3 men bringing a little girl to the amusement park. According to the radar map mark given by Li Qishao, Su Lo drove the black car around the mountainside road. Suddenly, there was a wide open space in front of him. The lively amusement park was temporarily left behind. In front of him, there was a layer of fog on the mountainside opposite him. In the fog, he could vaguely see a manor. Behind the manor, there was a large area of slightly undulating green grass between the autumn hills. Building a golf course in the middle of the valley, this manor was really amazing. What surprised the three people in the car even more was that on the cliff to the right of the manor, there was a line shining with a metallic luster. Looking at it carefully, they found that it was an open-air elevator more than a kilometer long. Looking at the direction, it directly led to the large amusement park in front of them. This kind of design momentum couldn't be called big, but it should be called incomparably luxurious. After verifying the citizen information at the entrance of the manor, a staff member in a black suit bowed his head respectfully and got on the electric scooter in front to lead the way for the black scooter and the dark green military vehicle behind. After traveling for a short while in the slightly foggy valley, they passed through two deliberately arranged stone gates and arrived at their destination. After getting off the car, Sulu held Zhong Huiyan's little hand and walked straight ahead. Li Wei turned up his collar and followed behind the two. With a cigarette in his mouth, he looked at the furnishings in the manor with a complicated expression. He was shocked by the noble atmosphere here and was a little speechless. The staff member led the group to a door and left. Sulu looked at the intoxicating wood door in front of him and thought that this door alone was probably worth a year of his salary. Although he knew that Li Xiaotong and Little Watermelon were qualified enough to enjoy this kind of extravagance, and he had been in many high-end places in the past few years, he still couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. The moment the intoxicating wood door was pushed open, there was a sudden burst of crackling sounds in the room. Sulu narrowed his eyes and his pupils shrank and then dispersed. In an instant, he knew that he hadn't been ambushed. These crackling sounds weren't gunshots, but small fireworks in the room. Because of the countless shredded paper shimmering with rainbow colors under the light, it was like a fairy scattering flowers. Among the scattered paper fireworks, there was a neat sound in the originally quiet room. 8 beautiful girls with beautiful eyebrows and picturesque eyebrows bowed deeply to Sulu, who had pushed open the intoxicating wood door. They smiled and said, "Hello, Brother Sulu." What made people's eyes feel as if they had just been washed by water was their cute and seductive outfits. The light yellow miniskirts were close-fitting, showing off the curves of the young girls who were already tall and straight but still slightly young. The close-fitting yellow miniskirts were so short that it couldn't be any shorter. There was even a small slit on both sides, showing off the legs that were full of youthful elasticity and vitality. They were as white as the tender core of a willow tree after being peeled off its bark. The 8 girls were all first-year students of the Federation's Academy of Arts. The oldest was only 16 years old. They had not been tainted by too much worldly dust and were attracted to this place by the irresistible money and future. They had a trace of pure and decadent aura that was hard to resist. Yellow, tender, energetic, pure. All of these were gathered on these 8 girls, but it was all for the sake of highlighting the word tender. Coupled with the phrase, Big Brother Sulu, that was deliberately trained, if it was any other man who saw this scene, he would probably feel a wave of youthfulness rushing towards him, and his mind would sway and be unable to control himself. The 7th young master of the Li family was sitting on the sofa, smiling as he looked at the door. He thought to himself, Mugu's arrangements are indeed beautiful. Sulu, no matter how strange your request is, I'm sure you'll be satisfied with this formation. Li Wei was very satisfied. He stood behind Sulu with his mouth wide open, completely speechless. He thought to himself, isn't Sulu doing too well now? He's actually playing the drama of finding his first love. You should know that we didn't properly go to school when we were young. Could it be that you had a crush on someone back then? Sulu looked at the 8 girls who were smiling sweetly like lotuses in a river. His heart had long been in a mess. He vaguely understood that there was a problem with the communication between him and Li Qishao. While he was shocked, he remembered that Little Watermelon was still behind him. If this little girl saw this scene, no matter how naive she was, she would be able to roughly understand what was going on. With this thought in mind, the 8 delicate lotuses in front of him suddenly turned into a thicket of more than 3,000 sharp blades, stabbing under his butt, causing him to be in so much pain that he wished he was dead. Little Zhong Yanhua felt the strangeness in front of her and curiously poked her head out from behind Su Li's back. Su Li's reaction was surprisingly fast. He quickly displayed the 10 postures that the uncle had taught him. His right hand moved horizontally to the right as if it was splitting a mountain, firmly blocking the little girl's face. Just as he was about to give Li Xiaotong a wink, the little girl beside him exclaimed in surprise and admiration. "Cool!" The little girl, Zhong Yanhua, stood on tiptoe, her pair of lively black eyes staring at the edge of Su Li's palm. Her eyes were wide open as she looked at the lotus-shaped girls not far in front of her. After clearing the place, Su Li had to admit that the club arranged by Li Xiaotong was indeed clean and fun. It was not a place specially used for that kind of shady business. Going down the open-air elevator on the cliff, there were countless things suitable for little girls to play with. But in the end, he lost face in front of little Watermelon. Every time he thought of the 8 lotus-shaped girls calling Su Li brother in unison, and then thought of little Watermelon's exclamation of "cool," he felt his face become a little hot. "Can't you make it clear on the phone?" Li Qishao stared at him with a gloomy face. Su Li angrily retorted, "How did I not make it clear? It's just that you perverted children of aristocratic families always have such complicated thoughts. Look at those little girls you found, I'm afraid some of them have just turned 14. Li Xiaotong cut off the seal of the coarse tobacco and handed 2 sticks to him and Li Wei beside him. "Don't mention this. Fortunately, Wood Valley is really clean and no outsiders come here. Usually, only a few family members who are familiar with each other come here for a holiday." He did not know Li Wei, but from the way Li Wei held the tobacco and some details, he could tell that this young man should belong to the lowest group of people in society. But he also knew that Su Li did not have many friends in the Federation. For this person called Li Wei to be introduced as a friend by Su Li in such a serious manner, he naturally could not be underestimated. Wood Valley. After coming in, I keep feeling that the style here is somewhat familiar. Su Li raised his head and glanced at the elegant furnishings in the room, squinting his eyes as he tried to distinguish the authenticity of the paintings. Chapter 363. Wood Valley is the property of the Lin family. After Lin Banshan broke the door, he no longer cared about the family's affairs. Of course, the old men of the previous generation of the Lin family were unwilling to give up. They begged and pestered people to enter the Lin garden. They shamelessly learned from the Lin garden and built such a place. Li Xiaotong rubbed the thick tobacco with 2 fingers and lowered his head. This garden not only imitated the form, but also the spirit. Plus, the special administrative region government built a large entertainment area on the other side of the mountain, so it's very suitable for a family vacation. It's said that President Sieg liked it very much when he came for a summer vacation 2 years ago. Unfortunately, this mountain is not as good as the White Mountain behind Linyuan. Also, there's no airport, so it's not very convenient. Fortunately, there's a lot of clouds in the mountain, which makes up for some of the disadvantages. Su Li took a sip of red wine and pursed his lips. During high-class occasions in the capital ring, the place he went the most was Linyuan. He often sat by the flowing water of the bamboo residence. He had a deep impression of the White Mountain under the curtain of night and the private jet taking off and landing from time to time. That was the first impact of the Federation's wealth on his heart. Now that he heard Li Xiaotong's words and thought of the noble aura he saw when he entered the manor, he thought that it was no wonder. Li Wei did not know Li Xiaotong. He only knew that this gloomy young master was probably a big shot, but he could not imagine that this person was one of the 7 legendary family's heirs. He held the thick tobacco clumsily and lowered his head to listen to the conversation between Su Li and Li Qishao. The two talked about the president, the private airport and other unfamiliar terms, which made him even more silent. He did not want to do anything inappropriate or say anything ridiculous. He could only enter the manor as Su Li's friend, so he did not want to lose face for Su Lu. It had been some time since he crashed into the top circle of the Federation, but Su Lu still had not figured out the brand or the so-called foundation of the coarse tobacco and red wine. As for the year, the rainwater, the pH of the soil, and the complicated relationship between the taste and taste, he was even more confused. Perhaps it would have been easier for him to recite and evaluate the paintings in the room according to the Dictionary of Art Evaluation in the library. However, this did not affect him from taking a puff of tobacco and a sip of red wine. When it came to enjoyment, perhaps one could enjoy it at a higher level by knowing the reason. However, that was all he could do to at least satisfy the physiological feelings of his senses. Placing the coarse tobacco on a large ashtray made of red-brown rice stone, Su Lu at least learned not to flick the ash. After a moment of silence, he said to Li Xiaotong, "Both the Li family and the Lin family want me dead, but because of you, maybe the Li family can tolerate me." The Lin family. I've beaten up Lin Daohai and trampled over Lin Yuanhu. It feels weird to be a guest at their property. This is an open business. A family like the one we grew up in will never solve all the grudges on the surface. Li Xiaotong said faintly, "Everyone has to abide by the rules." Although Lin Daohai is brave and fierce, it's impossible for him to use an automatic rifle to sweep you away. In this world, other than you and Lin Banshan, who would do such a thing? Su Lu heard the hidden meaning in this sentence and smiled. Coincidentally, I only found out when I came. Lin Daohai and the leader's son who was beaten up by you at the banquet are also here. However, I don't think the two of them dare to disturb your mood. Li Xiaotong raised the wine glass in his hand and said with a smile, "How many people in the Federation dare to mess with you now? You make me sound like a playboy." "Right, I didn't expect you to bring a little friend here. I was going to introduce some people to you today." Li Xiaotong put down the wine glass and said, "Of course, they are all people with ulterior motives. They have some power in the S1 states. Apart from a few people who are interested in the little money I have on hand, the others are only here to make early investments. You can understand from this point alone that they are not really powerful people. At most, they are second-tier people." Su Lu understood. Even if Li Qishao was the second successor of the Li family in name, as long as that beautiful Li Shuzhu was still alive and didn't make the decisive mistake of the last presidential election, he would always be at a disadvantage in the competition. Your money is not a little money. Perhaps it was because of Su Li's sudden appearance that the old men of the Li family, who had always been calculating, discovered for the first time that the Li family's seventh brother had a vision for investment. In just a dozen months, the private investment fund that he could control had risen to 970 million yuan. This amount of money could be considered a great fortune anywhere in the Federation. However, in the eyes of people like Li Xiaotong, compared to the vast wealth of his family, it was naturally just a little money. "I don't have much interest in those investments. I'm going to keep all this money for you." Li Xiaotong's face was grave and stern. His collar was neat and cold like thin leaves hanging on branches in a snowy day. It is often stupid to invest separately. Although I haven't seen the crown prince you promised to introduce me to, now I am more and more convinced that just by investing in you, I will definitely get countless times more returns in the future. Li Xiaotong said very seriously, and Su Lu also heard it very clearly. If Li Xiaotong could really win his personal friendship, in the future battle for the inheritance of the Li family, those old men would have to consider the attitude of that old man in Philadelphia. Although it was certainly not decisive, it was a very important bargaining chip. "I have only met that old man once," Su Lu reminded him. "It doesn't matter. At least now everyone thinks that you are related to the Lis of Philadelphia." Li Xiaotong smiled slightly, and the coldness between his eyebrows gradually disappeared. Some people are even guessing that you are that old man's illegitimate son who has been living outside. Su Lui did not spit out the red wine in his mouth. He slowly swallowed it and only felt bitter. He shook his head and sighed. The age doesn't match. So what? The tricks that the president and the parliament are doing now are making those old men in the family very distressed. Li Xiaotong said lightly, the current federation is no longer the old federation. Except for that madam, who dares to face the government directly. Only that tiger in the West Woods dares to scold the officials of the National Security Council at the joint conference. Why? Of course, it is because he has someone with a gun. My family has always been very envious and has been trying to establish some kind of close relationship with the military, but there has been no progress. My side seems to be progressing faster, so of course they are happy to see it happen. Su Lu knew that the biggest problem the Li family was facing now was the gold fusion algorithm proposed by President Pabre and forcibly passed by the Federation Management Committee. However, he did not know what other path the Li family could take to establish a close relationship with the military other than himself. At this time, Zhong Huiyan, who was brought to the room by the maid, finally put on her clothes and skipped out. The little girl came in front of Su Lu and held her chin with both hands. She blinked and said with a smile, "Brother Su Lu, do I look good?" Su Lu looked at the cute little raccoon in front of him. He did not expect Li Qishao to find a way to make the little girl happy in such a short time. He could not help but feel admiration. The 8 lotus-like young girls had already retreated, leaving behind only 2 who were in charge of the reception. Su Lu looked at the young girl with delicate features and sincerely thanked her. "That's your circle. If you need me to meet them, I will come back later." Su Lu stood up and held Zhong Huiyan's small hand with her furry raccoon. He looked at Li Xiaotong and said with a wry smile, "My main task today is to play with her." He knew very well that the party Li Xiaotong arranged today was not necessarily an attempt to drag him into a certain circle, but it could be assumed that he also had some intention of taking advantage of the situation. After all, his origin as the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation had already become a hot topic in the upper-class society of the Federation. If he appeared, it would definitely be a bonus for Li Qishao. Li Xiaotong indifferently spread out his right hand, indicating that he could do as he pleased. Looking at the back of Su Lu and the little girl dressed as a raccoon disappearing, he could not help but feel a little strange. Which family's child was this? Unexpectedly, Su Lu doted on her so much. Looking at the faint pride between her eyebrows and the calmness in the luxurious environment of the Wood Valley Manor, she must not be a child of an ordinary family. But he never thought of going to the Zhong family in the West Woods. In his opinion, Su Lu, a guy with a military background, was very close to the crown prince of the Tai family, and was also carefully nurtured by the old man in Philadelphia. His fate was already very good. If the little girl was the little princess of the Zhong family, Li Qishao was afraid that he would painfully pull his hair and sigh that this kid's luck was already heaven-defying. Su Lu took the little girl to the amusement park in front of the mountain to enjoy life no longer alone. Li Wei, on the other hand, did not know why he stayed behind. The number of people in the second courtyard of the Wood Valley gradually increased. Li Xiaotong did not have the time to take care of this unknown person. After giving a few instructions to the housekeeper, he began to seriously talk with the guests. These guests were dressed very plainly, but if one were to carefully examine them, they would definitely be shocked by the handmade symbols embroidered with silk that represented money. Li Wei didn't understand these things, so he just listened quietly. With the spirit of a small fry, it only took him 10 minutes to clearly determine that the middle-aged and young people who were qualified to appear in this big house were not ordinary people. Except for a few people who were obviously as nervous as him, the rest were all big shots. Being in such an environment, Li Wei concealed his nervousness very well. While sighing, his ears perked up. Especially when he heard that two of the fat people were big businessmen who did trade with Bermuda, the tip of his ears slightly trembled. The only one who stayed behind was the young girl, First Lotus. She was quietly and innocently listening to a topic that she would never hear in the Federation Academy of Arts. Suddenly, she was called to Li Wei's side. Li Wei lowered his voice and asked, "What's your name?" "My name is Xiao Shi." The young girl was a little nervous and cute as she answered. Li Wei whispered, "Can you give me a pen and paper?" Xiao Shi thought that this man wanted to give her contact information, and a trace of pride appeared in her delicate and charming eyes. Although this guest was dressed very plainly and not like the others who were pretending to be plain, she only knew that those who could come here were not small people. Perhaps this guest liked to play this kind of game. Thinking of this, the trace of pride between her eyebrows turned into gentleness and she said softly, "Wait a moment." Chapter 364. Li Wei, who had been at the bottom of society since he was a child, had just been rescued by the West Woods soldiers from the Bermuda Star region. Naturally, he did not have any cards with him. As it was his first time entering the capital ring, he was still unable to adapt to the shock in his heart. However, any small character with ambition and courage would not let go of any opportunity to come into contact with a new world. He took out pieces of plain white paper and exchanged them for expensive cards made of pure plant fiber. The paper had his name and contact information written on it. The powerful figures of the various provinces did not know who this submissive and even somewhat uncomfortable young man was, but anyone who could appear at the 7th Young Masters gathering would surely have a chance to soar into the sky in the future even if they were still unknown. Naturally, no one would reject his somewhat awkward method of exchanging information, but there would occasionally be a hint of imperceptible contempt flashing across their faces. Li Xiaotong sat on the sofa and watched this scene calmly. He knew that the contempt in the eyes of these guests was not because of Li Wei's attire, but because of his expression. After all, the only thing Li Wei could bring out was the wisdom of struggling to rise from the bottom of society. If he could really accurately judge the situation today, there was no way he would be so humble no matter what. However, even so, looking at Li Wei's submissive and humble manner, 7th Young Master Li still felt a sense of admiration for this small character. He was also 90% suspicious. This 90% suspicious was because he was very curious. What kind of place could give Su Lu and this young man named Li Wei the courage to clumsily but persistently break certain rules and enter certain circles? After playing crazily in the amusement park for the whole morning, Su Li's face was pale from the torment of the roller coaster ride. He held Zhong Huiyan's small hand and walked up the awe-inspiring open-air elevator at the edge of the cliff. Only when the autumn wind blew on his face did his spirit recover slightly. He did not understand why the roller coaster ride was scarier than the mecha training. Zhong Huiyan was still wearing the brown raccoon costume, but the raccoon head had long been removed. Her red face was full of sweat and her hair was wet. Her smiling eyes were still filled with excitement, happiness, and a trace of reluctance. Madame Zhong said that you have to take a nap. We'll play again in the afternoon. Su Lu held the handrail of the elevator and took out a handkerchief with his right hand to wipe the girl's sweat. He was a little worried that she would catch a cold from the mountain wind. However, on this steep cliff, the girl didn't seem to be afraid at all. Yes. Zhong Huiyan nodded heavily. Including the armed members of Team 7, there were 8 people in the elevator. They arrived at the side entrance of Wood Valley Manor halfway up the mountain and met up with Lan Xiaolong, who was guarding the elevator. Lan Xiaolong leaned close to his ear and whispered something. Su Lu was slightly startled and looked to the right. Behind an antique screen wall, 2 ancient pines poked their heads out. There was a group of people standing on the cliff in front of the screen wall, pointing out the mountains and rivers. There was an indescribable heroic spirit that reached the clouds. However, looking at the two proud faces in the middle of the group, Su Lo only felt that the clouds and mist in this beautiful mountain valley had dispersed too quickly. How could he see them again and let them sully this mountain scenery? Li Qishao said that they wouldn't disturb him, but there was an old Federation proverb that said that if they weren't true enemies, they wouldn't always be together because of fate. This seemed to be referring to this scene. Su Lo was afraid of trouble, but he also didn't want to cause trouble, let alone these two boring people. He glanced at the second son of Nanshui's leader, Nan Mingxiu, and the heir of the Lin family, Lin Dohai, and shook his head. He then held Zhong Huiyan's hand and stepped onto the stone path, preparing to leave. However, in the end, he underestimated the high degree of summation and magical power of the Federation proverb. The group of youths who were pointing out the mountains and rivers and pretending to have the aura of nobility just happened to rest at this moment. They were preparing to enjoy the most famous feast in Wood Valley. As soon as they turned around, they saw them. The two groups of people were stunned at the same time. No one said anything. The silence lasted for 3 seconds. Suddenly, Lin Dohai smiled and said, "What a coincidence. I didn't think that a small place like my family could actually invite such a big figure like you." Lin Dohai's original intention was to mock Su Lo, but now that the men of the 7th group were following Su Lo closely, it really did make Su Lo seem like a big figure. Many of the youths in the group revealed doubtful expressions. A few of the youths who had been fortunate enough to attend the charity banquet that night and watched the confrontation on the terrace revealed vigilant expressions. These days, Nan Mingxiu had been well received by the young masters of the Federation. He enjoyed the good old wine and knew delicious people that he could not enjoy in Green Dragon Mountain. He felt that his life was so happy. His father should have reconciled with the Federation long ago. Today, in the Wood Valley Manor, he had been well received by Lin Dohai. Just as he was in high spirits, he saw the person he hated the most. Nan Mingxiu was now clear about Su Li's background. However, how could an idiot develop into a proud idiot? Naturally, it was because he believed that his background was greater and was used to speaking with his background and fists. The Federation strictly controlled firearms, but gave the Green Dragon Mountain delegation great privileges, allowing them to bring a group of independent military forces into the capital. The Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain knew that the government's arrangement was to express goodwill, so they did not bring many people from S2. There were only 30 or so people who were responsible for the daily protection of the delegation. And it was this group of brave and skilled anti-government soldiers that ended up being taken away by Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son. At this time, these 10 soldiers all stood behind him. On the balcony of the reception party, Su Lo understood the principle of light, wind and cloud from the barrel of a gun. Nan Mingxiu, the leader's son, undoubtedly also understood this point. So today, he was even more insufferably arrogant than before. The gloomy anger on his face was not concealed at all. He walked directly in front of Su Lo and the others and coldly said, "Last time at the reception, you warned me once. Today, I want to return that warning to you." Su Lo looked at the leader's son in front of him. He wondered if the people from Green Dragon Mountain all had some mental problems. Zhang Xiaomeng was such a good girl, yet she was forcibly harmed to such an extent. However, Mr. Sher's group of professional spies did not seem to be so stupid. Oh, right, that was because Mr. Zhong Kai's deep sea was not in Green Dragon Mountain at all. Since you and Comrade Zhang Xiaomeng have nothing to do with each other anymore, I think you should not interfere with the matters between me and her in the future. Nan Mingxiu's face was gloomy. He thought he was very tolerant and gracious when he said this. Then, he lowered his voice and said to Su Lo, "No matter how strong your background is, what right do you have to interfere with our internal affairs? The matters between Zhang Xiaomeng and I are not for you to interfere. After all, you are just an ex-boyfriend." Don't worry, when I get her, I will report to you. Nan Mingxiu made a mistake. He only found out about the relationship between Su Lo and the Lees of Philadelphia. He did not know about the violent deeds of Su Lo that made the entire upper class of the Federation fall into a dilemma. He also did not know that Su Lo was not best at verbal attacks, but was best at fists. 2 years ago, at the Double Moon Festival Ball, Counselor Sun Sun had said something similar. It seemed that whether it was the privileged class of the Federation or the privileged class of the anti-government army, they were very similar in this aspect. They knew how to make a man angry, but they forgot what the price of anger was. Counselor Sun Sun paid with a few broken teeth and a face full of blood. What about this leader's son? Su Lo still quietly narrowed his eyes and looked at him. The story on the balcony of the reception party had already spread in the Federation. The men of Group 7 knew very well about the very complicated emotional entanglement between their manager and Green Dragon Mountain's Yi. Lan Xiaolong shrugged behind him, shook his head, and said faintly, "Brother, I am not a person who likes to stir up trouble, but if you can still tolerate this matter, I really can't stand it." As his voice fell, under the ancient pine trees halfway up the cliff, a gust of wind blew in front of the screen wall. Su Lo raised his hand, grabbed Nan Mingxiu's throat, and directly pushed him against the screen wall, making a muffled sound. The anti-government army special guards who had been vigilantly protecting Nan Mingxiu immediately took out their guns nervously and aimed at Su Li's back. However, immediately afterwards, a shadow blocked the muzzle of their guns. Apart from Xiong Linquan, who had a special gun permit and could carry guns at all times, the men of Group 7 all had their guns in the military vehicles and could not carry them with them. However, even so, they still had cold expressions, fearlessly blocking Su Li's back. In front of the muzzle of their guns, it was as if they did not care at all even if the muzzle of these soldiers' guns sprayed out. "Put down your guns." Lin Dohai saw this scene, and a chill rushed to his brain. He shouted loudly while blocking in front of those Green Dragon Mountain soldiers without any regard for his precious body. Those soldiers knew that this person was on good terms with the leader's son, so they subconsciously lowered the muzzle of their guns. Lin Dohai let out a sigh of relief. Although he hated Su Lo very much, he knew that if these soldiers were allowed to shoot Su Lo or Su Li's security personnel to death, or even injure them, if that old man from Philadelphia was angry, who in the Federation could withstand the old man's anger? Su Lo did not care about the muzzle of the guns behind him. This was the Lin family's territory. Even if Lin Dohai was extremely stupid, he would not let these anti-government soldiers open fire. Furthermore, Nan Mingxiu's throat was in his hands. These loyal and stupid anti-government soldiers would not dare to act rashly. He stared at Nan Mingxiu's flushed face, his eyes gradually showing fear, and said in a low voice, "You are right, Zhang Xiaomeng is not my woman now. However, no matter who wants to be her man, I have to give the nod." Many people on the cliff heard this sentence and could not help but change their expressions. They thought that this young master was too fucking unreasonable. Even Lan Xiaolong, who claimed that he did not like to stir up trouble, but was actually stirring up trouble everywhere, could not help but be shocked speechless by this tyrannical and unreasonable sentence. Cool. After hearing Su Li's announcement, Zhong Yanhua, who was hugging the cute raccoon head, opened her eyes wide and exclaimed softly. Chapter 365. When Lin Daohai brought out his status as the successor of the Lin family, it was quite convincing. After all, compared to the Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government army, the history of the 7 great families was more than twice as long. What was even more confusing was that the Green Dragon Mountain's bloodline, which overthrew the 7 great families as representatives of all evils, seemed to never lack dog-shit characters like Nan Mingxiu, who deeply envied and even faintly revered the 7 great families. "I'm going to kill him." Nan Mingxiu listened to Lin Dohai's advice and suppressed his anger with great difficulty. He rubbed his aching neck and stared at the backs of the people disappearing on the stone path. His eyes flashed with a trace of gloominess as he rubbed his throat and said in a hoarse voice. Probably because he often said these kinds of meaningless threats in Green Dragon Mountain, the soldiers of the anti-government army didn't show any strange expressions on their faces. The problem was that if this was Green Dragon Mountain, perhaps this leader could really kill someone. But in the capital city, even in the suburbs, he didn't have this kind of ability. Even the eagles of the mountains would have to hide in this kind of place, the tigers would have to lie down, and the giant serpents would have to coil up. The prosperous and developed S1 had this kind of ability that pervaded the air. It was probably because of this that the leader of Nan Shui insisted on not taking a position in the Federation government and continued to stay in the barren Green Dragon Mountain. Nan Mingxiu was indeed very angry, but when he thought of the coldness in that young officer's narrowed eyes and the iron-like hand on his throat, his heart was filled with endless fear, even his legs became a bit weak. You can't kill him. Lin Dohai looked at Nan Mingxiu with slight ridicule. For a moment, he forgot to pretend to respect this leader's son, probably because it was rare to find someone more useless than him. Right now you are Chairman Jin Jifan's secretary in name, then you should be very clear, who was Chairman Jin's number 2 person before. Lin Dohai patiently taught, the person you want to kill, once directly charged into the 4 provinces and killed your number 2 person. If you force this kind of ruthless person into a corner, what good will it do you? Nan Mingxiu's body trembled as he looked at him in disbelief. After a long silence, he said in a trembling voice, didn't you say before, the Federation is a society ruled by law, not Green Dragon Mountain, and we can't just randomly shout and kill? I'm not talking to you anymore. Lin Dohai said in annoyance. He thought to himself, I've already told you that this brat has climbed up the mountain known as the Lees of Philadelphia. Why would he care about something like the Federation's laws? This was probably the true opinion of the 7 great families and most of the upper echelons of the Federation towards Su Lu, this young lieutenant colonel. Hidden within their forbearance was infinite vigilance and fear, whether it was gloomy or fearful, Su Lu didn't care. No matter what other people thought or felt about him, it wouldn't affect him. Being cursed behind his back wouldn't give him a headache, as long as he could ensure that the other party wouldn't hurt him and the people he cared about. The conflict between him and the leader's son seemed to be caused by Lin Dohai's sarcasm, Lan Xiaolong's not stirring up trouble, and this person's stupidity and arrogance, but only Su Lu himself knew the truth. Just by looking at Nan Mingxiu, he thought of the girl holding his arm at the banquet. He thought of how this person had once revealed a naked desire of possession, wanting to eliminate some troubles for a certain girl in advance. Su Lu didn't have the ability to see lightning like the old man of Philadelphia. Naturally, he didn't really expect to scare the arrogant and willful Nan Mingxiu into not daring to do anything. However, he believed that after he left, Lin Dohai would definitely tell the people of Green Dragon Mountain about his glorious deeds in order to hide his incompetence in his own territory. If those glorious deeds still couldn't wake Nan Mingxiu up, then it could only mean that this person was stupid to an incomprehensible degree. A person as stupid as this should have died a long time ago. It seemed that Macklin's death at his hands was still a secret. However, this secret couldn't be kept for too long, especially in a certain level of the Federation society. In the number 1 courtyard of the Wood Valley, the subordinate sent by the 7th young master to serve Su Lu and his group reported everything that happened on the way to him. Li Xiaotong, with a cold face, saw that Su Li's expression seemed to be as usual. Only then did he feel relieved. He asked a few questions briefly and didn't mention it again. According to Mrs. Zhong's instructions, Zhong Huiyan went to take a nap full of excitement, but she didn't know if she could fall asleep. In this little girl's opinion, the fun brought by those crazy activities in the morning was far less fun than Brother Su Lu showing his small hand under the pine tree halfway up the cliff and saying those words. In the extremely spacious main courtyard, a simple lunch was in progress. The food was naturally exquisite, but the guests present were not too interested in it. Their main purpose today was to get close to the calculative seventh young master. There weren't many guests. After lunch, 6 or 7 middle-aged and young people intentionally or unintentionally surrounded Li Xiaotong. They looked at the authentic paintings in the number 1 courtyard of the Wood Valley and discussed in low voices. Although the backgrounds of these people were far inferior to the 7 great families, they had grown up in a cultural environment built by money since childhood. Their eyesight was not too bad, and their words were always exquisite. Li Xiaotong indifferently chatted with the guests, but from time to time, he glanced at Su Lu in the corner from the corner of his eyes. When he found that guy was still seriously eating the yellow cake with caviar, he couldn't help but smile slightly. During the lunch, he didn't introduce Su Li's identity. He didn't even deliberately talk to Su Lu in front of these guests. He just wanted to see what kind of attitude these guests would have before they knew Su Li's background. In some ways, the 7th young master of the Li family was more outstanding than his lifelong rival, Li Shuzhu. Su Lu knew that the role he had to play today was a flag with a big Li written on it. Although he admitted that his relationship with the Lis of Philadelphia was not as exaggerated as the rumors in the Federation, since Li Xiaotong wanted to use the flag to scare people, he could only let him do it. Presumably, that old man wouldn't care about such a small matter. He was wearing a military uniform today and deliberately didn't wear epaulets. Although it was somewhat against military regulations, if he didn't want to always be looked at in shock, there seemed to be no other way. It was also for this reason that the guests in the courtyard didn't recognize him. They just politely nodded with a sense of distance and walked away. While waiting for Li Qishao to unfurl his flag, he quickly ate. Thinking that he still had to accompany little Watermelon to the amusement park in the afternoon, he decided to eat his fill first. Otherwise, if his face really turned pale and he fainted next to the little girl, he was afraid that he would lose face again. He had already lost face many times today, and he was afraid that he would lose face again. Now that the taste buds on his tongue had gradually gotten used to the rich taste of the caviar, he didn't frown like he did in the H1 area. Li Wei had been quietly listening to Li Qishao's circle. He didn't say a word, but he also didn't miss a single word. Su Lu noticed this, but he knew his character since he was young, so he didn't find it strange and didn't want to disturb him. The sun shone through the ancient trees above the courtyard, and it was very quiet. Su Lu ate his food quietly, but he didn't expect that a slightly chubby middle-aged man would suddenly find him. This middle-aged man introduced himself. His surname was Qing, and his name was Feng Shi. He was a researcher at the Darcy State Mechanical College. This person made a design that he was very proud of, but he couldn't find a sponsor to continue his research. Through some unknown means, he somehow managed to find an opportunity to enter the first courtyard of the Wood Valley. However, after staying in the first courtyard for a few hours, Qing Fengshi found that he couldn't find any opportunity to promote his research. He was somewhat dejected. He didn't know that the gloomy young man was the second successor of the Li family. He only knew that there were a lot of important people in the guests today, and people like him didn't have the opportunity to speak. After struggling for a while, Qing Fengshi was finally unwilling to give up. He had the thought of smashing a jar that had already been broken, so he set his eyes on Su Lu. In his opinion, this young officer who no one paid attention to was probably like him, who also came to the first courtyard for some unknown reason. Even if the other party didn't have money, it was always good to communicate and show off one's proud work. Micro-turbocharger system. A hydrogen-based turbocharger system. Su Lu held a handkerchief with the scent of osmanthus in one hand and wiped the remnants of caviar on his lips. His other hand was holding a few pieces of paper and looking at them. His voice was full of surprise. As an excellent mechanical engineer, he quickly saw the value of these few pages of paper. More importantly, the direction of Qing Fengshu's research seemed to be feasible. Yes, but what are you going to use for the oxidizer? Su Lu put down the handkerchief and asked doubtfully, and I don't understand. The current standard output model used by the Federation has abandoned turbochargers for many years. Especially if you want to do miniaturization, how are you going to pass the material hurdle? Also, isn't the interference of the leaf suction in the design a bit too big? Qing Fengshu was slightly stunned, but then he was overjoyed. He didn't think that the person he randomly found would be so knowledgeable. Although the question was simple, it hit the nail on the head. Although he still didn't have much hope for the project's financing, he was happy to have found a kindred spirit. Using his sweaty hands to flip through the few pages of paper, he vaguely explained. Su Lu scratched his head, thinking that this person's thinking was really sharp. It was just that his explanation was too poor. The more he listened, the more serious he became. After a while, he looked at Qing Fengshu and said, "The School of Mechanics didn't allocate any funds." Qing Fengshu used his sleeve to wipe the sweat on his forehead. He smiled bitterly and said, "The miniaturization of turbochargers is indeed good for the instantaneous power output of certain small equipment, but the cost-performance ratio is too low. There's no commercial future. Not to mention the school, I've been looking for investments in society for 2 years, but I haven't found anyone willing to invest." Su Li's eyes narrowed, then gradually brightened. Unlike Qing Fengshu's worries, he quickly remembered that there was one area in the world that didn't care about cost-performance ratio. That was, high-end weapons used to kill people, such as mechas. At this time, Li Xiaotong and the other guests were casually talking about calligraphy and painting. No one noticed that in the corner of the courtyard, Su Lu and this middle-aged man were seriously discussing mechanical matters. "Do you need money?" Su Lu looked at the time. The little girl's afternoon nap should be ending soon, so he asked Qing Fengshu. Qing Fengshu nodded honestly and helplessly. "It's a lot of money." Chapter 366. To be able to walk such a stable and successful business path and come into contact with existences at the level of the 7 great families, which of the guests in the room was not a character that had cultivated into a spirit? Suddenly hearing Li Xiaotong's name from the courtyard, everyone looked back. There were many different expressions on their faces. Some were shocked, some were frowning, and some were secretly pondering. Under all the different expressions, there was a common trace of pity. How many people dared to call the 7th young master by his name? Everyone understood that they had misjudged the young officer in the courtyard. Li Xiaotong slightly frowned, walked out of the room, and came to the courtyard that was full of sunlight and mottled shadows. He looked at the slightly chubby middle-aged man beside Su Lu and tilted his head, thinking that he did not seem to know this person. A subordinate leaned over and whispered a few words in his ear, and then he showed a look of understanding, because he was worried that Su Lu, this rock, would not be able to adapt to the atmosphere of today's gathering. He let his subordinates casually choose 2 researchers who were looking for investment. He thought that Su Lu was a genius engineer and would naturally have more in common with this kind of person. Li Xiaotong was very talented in investing money, but he really did not expect that mechanical engineering was actually divided into many categories. Looking at Su Lu standing beside the middle-aged man and flipping through a few pieces of paper, Li Xiaotong could not help but feel a trace of interest. Could it be that this middle-aged man had successfully convinced him? "What's the matter?" Li Xiaotong walked over. "I think this project is very interesting and worth investing some money." Su Lu looked at him and said, "Look at his materials first, but it's a bit messy. How can I not trust your judgment in this aspect?" Li Xiaotong said, "I won't understand even if you show it to me. Since you say it's interesting, then it really means it. How much do you want to invest?" Su Lu smiled, turned to Qing Fengshu and asked, "How much is the budget for your research?" Qing Fengshe nervously looked at Li Xiaotong, very nervously and apologetically extended 2 fingers, and said in a low voice, the initial. 200 million. Li Xiaotong was slightly stunned. He didn't expect that the investment would be so high at the beginning. It should be known that the funds he could freely use now were less than 1 billion. He couldn't help but look at Su Lo inquiringly. Looking at Li Xiaotong's inquiring eyes, Qing Fengshe's confidence, which he thought was unreasonable, suddenly disappeared. In the past few years, there had always been investors who could see the prospects of this project, but at the same time, they could see that there was no way to do business, so they all coldly refused. Was it going to happen again today? To his surprise, after he reported a budget of 200 million with great difficulty, Su Lo lowered his head and thought for a while. Then, he shook his head and said, 200 million is not enough. We need at least 300 million. Su Lo had learned a lot from Professor Shin in the Husk Institute. He had also dabbled in the material science aspects of the database index tree. In addition to his experience in the Harbor City Industrial Park last year, Su Lo had some understanding of the process and the general budget of a research and development project. Such a miniaturized turbocharging project seemed to be very inconspicuous, but to overcome the obstacles in between, it was absolutely impossible to spend less money. From 200 million to 300 million, Li Xiaotong, who was originally hesitant, no longer hesitated. At least, it didn't show on his face at all. In just 0.2 seconds, he smiled and said, "Okay." This word was very simple, but the 6 guests who silently watched this scene under the stone steps of the courtyard felt very complicated. They watched calmly and steadily, and didn't rush to do or say anything at this time. They secretly planned for what would happen later, such as how to make up for the previous neglect, how to smile, and how to get to know each other without leaving a trace. Directly calling the 7th young master's name, and casually asking the 7th young master to pay 300 million. For them, 300 million wasn't a lot, and it wasn't scary. What was scary was the attitude the 7th young master showed through this matter. The 3 people whispered a few words, and Qing Fengshe's face was full of excitement. As for whether they would use private funds to invest in the Darcy School of Mechanical Engineering or set up an independent research and development department, there would naturally be professionals to discuss with him. If there are any technical problems, I'll introduce someone to you. I believe her practical experience in this area will inspire you. Su Lo thought for a bit, wrote down Shang Qiu's contact information on a piece of paper, and handed it over. When he was about to say something, the phone in his military uniform started to vibrate. When he took out his phone, his expression suddenly became a bit weird. His fingers that pressed the call button were a bit stiff. When he heard the voice from the phone, he nodded his head. Silence reigned in the serene and elegant courtyard. Li Xiaotong frowned. He knew very well that although Su Lo was a kind person, he was definitely not docile. He didn't know who was on the other end of the phone, but he was actually able to turn him into a nodding bug. Seeing Su Lo take the phone and walk out of the courtyard, the guests in the courtyard were all guessing the identity of this officer. Occasionally, some people would think of a person that the federal military had been purposely cultivating recently, but because there had never been any rumors of that person being close to the Li family, they didn't dare to confirm. Only Qing Fengshe's attention was all on that piece of paper. He didn't notice Su Lo leaving at all. He stared blankly at the 2 words Shang Qiu and the extremely detailed personal contact information. He couldn't believe his eyes. Shang Qiu, the first-level technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department, the genius who designed the MX Mecha. Then, could this officer be that other person? When he thought of this, he was so shocked that he didn't have time to feel respect, but he was already in awe. The air in the courtyard was filled with an undercurrent of speculation and shock. The 7th young master of the Li family smiled slightly, and the dark aura around him faded slightly. He looked at the guests and said, "Don't be curious as to why I value his opinion so much. He can even set the standards for the MX Mecha. Within the Federation, there are probably not many people who don't believe in his judgment. If you don't believe me, you can ask Li Wei. They are good friends," Li Xiaotong added lightly at the end. His words confirmed Xing Fengshi's shock, and the disbelief of the crowd. Li Wei, who had been standing silently outside the circle, smiled somewhat embarrassedly at Li Xiaotong. He knew that the other was helping him, but until now, he still hadn't gotten used to the fact that Su Le had become some sort of influence that could be borrowed outside the courtyard. Some things always need to be done more professionally. You are a person who keeps his promises, and to carry out your promises, you need to be more careful, cautious, and persevering. The calm voice of the Federation's Minister of Defense, Zhou Yingxing, came from the other end of the phone. There was no purposeful so-called power in his voice, just like a scholar speaking slowly. Su Le lowered his head and acknowledged. Although his relationship with the Zhou family had become extremely close, it was rare for him to receive a call from Minister Zhou. Minister Zhou's words on the phone were very subtle, but he understood that the so-called focus, attention, and caution referred to everything related to taking the blame. Because of some sort of tacit agreement in the rain at the Milky Way Public Cemetery, this big boss of the West Mountain Courtyard had already taken the blame for Su Le many times in private. During the scene at the Four Prefectures Peace and Reconstruction Charity Banquet, although the people who met on the balcony were ex-lovers, since Su Le was already a scapegoat, his appearance would always make the Minister of Defense lose a lot of face. After all, he was nominally Zhou Liuhua's father. At this time, the sun was moving west, but it was far from dusk. Zhou Yingxing's phone call wasn't an accusation, but to Su Le, it was a very serious reminder. Under such circumstances, he could only nod and agree. After the phone call, Su Le sighed softly. Suddenly, he thought of the shout in the courtyard and suddenly fell silent. That subconscious shout was to help Li Xiaotong raise the flag, but was it not because he was intoxicated with the feeling of relying on the Li family to become a big shot in the end? It was like that at the banquet, and it was also like that today in the Wood Valley, and this seemed to be a very bad trend. In the silence, in the autumn forest burning under the sun, a girl quietly appeared. This girl had a head of thick black hair, slightly curled up at the ends of the hair over her ears. Paired with a pair of quiet and gentle eyes, she was very beautiful. Su Le was slightly startled, and bowed his head to greet the other party. The children of the 7 major families, who had always been mysterious, often appeared in front of him so easily. On second thought, the relationship between the Nan family and the Lin family was not shallow, and the Wood Valley Manor itself was a place for these families to socialize, so he felt relieved. Nan Xiangmei looked at Su Le and smiled gently, hiding the surprise and shyness in her eyes. She walked in front of him and quietly said, "Hello, should I call you Su Gong, or Lieutenant Colonel Su?" Su Le smiled and said, "Just call me Su Le." They had met by chance on the high-speed rail to Hong Kong, and they had exchanged a few words at a cocktail party. He was still unfamiliar with this beautiful girl, but deep in his heart, he had a very good impression of her. Even in his dreams, there was a trace of beauty floating faintly in his mind. Su Le was about to ask if she came with Lin Daohai, when suddenly there was a hurried voice from behind the forest. It seemed to be a middle-aged woman. Su Le was slightly startled, and Nan Xiangmei said apologetically, "The mama at home is calling, maybe the elders are bored playing cards, and want to talk with me." The 7 daughters of the 7 major families said such words to an unfamiliar opposite sex. It seemed a bit too intimate. Su Le was slightly startled, and said, "Then I won't disturb you." When Nan Xiangmei was about to leave, she suddenly clenched her hands on the side of the dark blue overalls, lowered her head and asked in a trembling voice, "I heard that the military is sending more troops to the West Woods. Are you going too?" "Maybe, but I'm not sure yet. It depends on what the ministry wants." Sulu didn't explain in detail, because he was a little surprised that this young lady would care about his affairs. There was a trace of panic and a trace of complex emotions in Nan Xiangmei's quiet eyes. Suddenly she lowered her voice and said, "The West Woods is very dangerous, you have to take care." "Thank you." Sulu was still puzzled, but he felt warm in his heart, so he seriously replied. Nan Xiangmei took a deep breath, suddenly raised her head, looked at him bravely, and said as calmly as possible with a smile, "Maybe you think it's ridiculous, but I have to tell you something." "What?" "I like you." After saying this sentence, Nan Xiangmei, whose cheeks were slightly red, lowered her head and ran away like a frightened deer, leaving Su Lo in the forest. He was so shocked that he didn't know what to say. That it was more than absurd, more than absurd. It was like a thunderbolt on a sunny day. Although it didn't really kill Su Lo, it shocked him so much that he was speechless. His brain was filled with the question of, "Who am I?" that had nothing to do with philosophy, because his logical thinking ability made him firmly refuse to believe that those 4 words were directed at him. He had experienced many soul-stirring events in his life, great joy and great sorrow and great joy mixed with the vicissitudes of life. Those events were even more terrifying and shocking than the words he heard in the autumn forest in the Wood Valley today, but it was extremely difficult for them to move him as much as they did today. Because he didn't understand why this quiet and beautiful daughter of an aristocratic family, whom he had only met twice, would, for no reason at all, use such simple yet extremely destructive words to attack him. "I like you." It was like going to the distribution station to buy protein meat, but the Bureau of Proclamation official told you that wild beef was on sale today. The black market butcher behind him was beaming with joy as he hooked his arm around the HTD bureau detective's shoulder. It was like the Federal Central Computer suddenly turned into a naked beauty, doing an S3-style hip dance in front of you. For Su Lo, who often chatted with the old guy, even if the latter thing really happened, he might have enough psychological capacity to bear it. But Nan Xiangmei's sudden confession shocked him to the core. He was so shocked that his hair stood up, and his general's hat was about to be lifted up. He didn't know that after leaving Harbor City, Nan Xiangmei, who had left her marriage contract, had tied her first budding feelings of a young girl to that ordinary engineer, who she had met by chance in the carriage and met again unexpectedly in Harbor City. He didn't know that Nan Xiangmei had been quietly inquiring about him for more than a year. She silently and nervously watched him change from a nutshell engineer to a guy who shocked many people in the Federation. That beautiful daughter of an aristocratic family even got his contact information from Li Xiaotong, but she didn't have the courage to contact him. Instead, she took advantage of the fact that Li Xiaotong was treating her family to a meal and encouraged her family to come to the Wood Valley Manor for the New Year festival. She stayed in the woods for a long time, just for a chance encounter. However, even if he knew this, Su Lo still turned into an ice sculpture. He stiffly looked at the back of the girl who disappeared into the woods, and couldn't say a word. Love at first sight. He admitted that he didn't have the peerless appearance of Mr. Shi and Li Shuzhu, he didn't have the gentle and kind temperament of Zhou Yu, and he didn't even have the quiet and strange temperament of Bai Yulan. He was just an ordinary person. How could he make a girl like him? And that girl was the daughter of the Nan Xiangmei family. Who am I? I'm Su Lo. I'm not handsome, and the interesting part of my personality has long been hidden by my boring stone appearance. Since childhood, I looked up at the starless sky and the TV in the pub. I liked the high and mighty purple-haired girl, but the two of them were separated by who knows how many light years. Later, I liked a girl who wore black-rimmed glasses, but the ending was not beautiful. In the matter of men and women, this stone of Donglin only knows how to look up, be silent, give, sacrifice, and be abandoned. It seems that it will be like this forever. However, this scene in the woods reminded him of Professor Shin's words, which were, "There is no reason in the universe." Chapter 367. Relationships were just like quantum physics. There was no universal truth that could be applied to all things in the world. If there is a real reason for liking or not liking, a mother-in-law doesn't need a wooden stick to break up a couple, just a computer is enough. The famous Federation's broken family member, Lin Banshan, boarded the high-speed train halfway and broke the marriage alliance between the Lin family and the Nan family. From that moment on, Nan Xiangmei, who had no choice but to accept everything arranged by her family, was like a goldfish in a broken fish tank, a fledgling in a broken net. She suddenly found that she had obtained a rare freedom, and saw the possibility of a blue sea and a blue sky, under the girl's beautiful and quiet face, who knows how many waves were raised. At that time, a hole was opened in her pink heart, but there was no one to fill it. At that time, Sulu sat next to her and gave her a very good first impression. This kind of good impression was also false, it was just sincere and honest. However, just like a newborn baby beast, it was used to recognizing the first person it saw as its closest parent. When a young girl was allowed to freely fall in love for the first time, the first man she saw that she had a good impression of would naturally leave a very deep impression on her. If this continues, it will just be a spring dream, a memory of old age with a smile and a faint self-deprecating smile. Since then, Sulu did not disappear from Nan Xiangmei's life. Instead, with a decisive attitude, he became a character often mentioned in the social circle of the 7 great families. Nan Xiangmei was endlessly curious about him. How could such a small character with no background make so many people of the Li family, Lin family, and Nan family unable to forget? So she paid attention, inquired, and silently watched. She knew a lot of Su Li's stories, including the story between him and Zhang Xiameng. These stories actually have the power to move girls, it's just that Su Lu himself didn't know. If Nan Xiangmei and Su Lu met often, perhaps these faint feelings would gradually fade away. It was just the initial trace of good feelings. As the daughter of the Nan Xiangmei who had read countless books, she definitely wouldn't be so naive to mistake that trace of good feelings for true love. Unfortunately, she didn't see it, so Nan Xiangmei could add her own imagination to Su Li's story, and imagination is often beautiful, the most unforgettable first meeting, the reason for not meeting again. The beautiful girl was used to silently asking about the small-eyed engineer. Gradually, she was peacefully and happily immersed in this habit, because she did not know that all feelings were actually just habits. After silently smoking a cigarette in the woods, Su Lu was still in a daze. Nan Xiangmei took the initiative to reveal her inner thoughts to an unfamiliar member of the opposite sex. What kind of courage and boldness was this? He didn't think about that for the time being. He just felt that what happened just now was a very experimental drama. The main thing was that it happened too suddenly, the two of them were too unfamiliar with each other, and he wasn't mentally prepared. Nan Xiangmei was worried that he would go to the battlefield in the West Woods, so she bravely expressed her feelings. But in the environment of the 3 words, too, Sulu only felt that there was a sudden clap of thunder in the silence. He was looking for a poem among the blades, but it turned out to be a pear blossom body. After washing his face in the mountain spring that was deliberately attracted, the cold spring water splashed on his slightly hot cheeks. Sulu realized that he couldn't help but feel excited and slightly proud after all. He was a poor man who only knew how to play with unrequited love and bitter love all his life. Suddenly, he became the target of someone's unrequited love, and that girl was the kind that he had a good impression of. Any man would probably have this kind of emotional reaction, right? Looking at the time, he was surprised to find that it was already past the agreed time with Little Watermelon. Thinking of the little girl's anxious look, he called Lon Xiaolong and asked Team 7 to protect Little Watermelon, while he walked out of the forest through the stone path. The cliff was directly next to the elevator. The ancient pine wall was on one side, but the blazing autumn sun was on the other side. The air was filled with a sultry and exciting feeling. In the Wood Valley Manor, those aristocratic families who were enjoying their early autumn vacation probably weren't in the mood to walk under such sunlight. Sulu wiped the sweat from his forehead. He couldn't help but guess which courtyard Nan Xiang's family was in. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a staff member in a black uniform by the cliff elevator. His body stiffened slightly. Under such a scorching sun, the staff member was still wearing a hat with a front brim. The shadow of the brim covered his face by about 80%, so his face couldn't be seen clearly. The key problem that made Sulu squint silently was that when he walked out of the screen wall, the staff member's right shoulder clearly moved slightly. Then, he stayed as still as before and stood silently by the console. In such a dry and hot environment, if the staff member had remained motionless, Sulu would only sigh that the service staff trained by the aristocratic families were indeed of high quality. However, the staff member had been standing still as before. Yet, at the moment when Sulu came out, his right shoulder moved slightly. Although this slight movement was subtle, it couldn't escape Sulu's sharp eyes. He looked down from the corner of his eye and found that the staff member was respectfully standing with his hands behind his back. So, he couldn't be sure if the staff member was holding anything in his hand, such as a gun. Sulu wasn't paranoid. Logically speaking, in a place like Wood Valley, it was absolutely impossible to assassinate someone. However, he was a person who paid great attention to details. Once all the details couldn't be calculated clearly, they would turn into intuition. He intuitively felt that there was something wrong with this person. If there was something wrong with this staff member hiding in the dark, then what was the problem? Obviously, he wasn't here to kill him. Sulu thought silently, but the burning power in his body had begun to quietly pour into his body. According to the original plan, he and Little Watermelon should have taken this elevator to the amusement park at the foot of the mountain. Could it be that the staff member wanted to deal with the Zhong family? Seeing that he was here alone, he gave up on the attack at the last minute. It's really hot today. Sulu shook his head and walked towards the staff member. At such a close distance, if the staff member was really a professional assassin, he had no confidence that he could dodge his shot. However, Little Watermelon was about to arrive. However, the staff member's style of doing things was extremely clean and efficient, to the point that it was chilling. When he found that Sulu was walking towards him, he didn't casually exchange a few words with Sulu as most people would expect. Instead, he directly took out his hand from behind his back. Unsurprisingly, a pistol appeared in his wide bronze palm. It was a silver-black large-caliber single-shot pistol that looked extremely cold. Chapter 368. The gunman's action of raising the gun was very natural and smooth. It was even very beautiful, as if he had practiced it countless times. People who saw this scene would even completely ignore what he was holding in his hand. The crisp and slightly rough gunshot rang out under the blazing hot afternoon under the ancient pine trees on the cliff. A high-speed bullet shot out of the black barrel coldly towards Sulu's chest. Sulu was not shocked by the gunman's posture when he pulled out the gun, because he did not see it at all. When the gunman's right shoulder moved, the muscles on his left leg instantly entangled like silk and burst out with a great force. It shook his body to the right and fiercely rushed towards the gunman's body. On the cliff, on the ancient pine trees, and on the screen wall, the small-eyed man was like a gray dragon. His body trembled slightly, and in the blink of an eye, he had already rushed 3 meters. As long as Sulu was close to the body, there were not many people in this universe who could effectively counterattack. This was a fact that had been proven by countless iron-blooded facts. It was very obvious that the assassin disguised as a staff member of the Lin family also knew this very well, so when the gunshot rang out, it was 3 consecutive shots. The first bullet brushed past the tiger-like Su Li's body and shot into the screen wall with a whoosh. The gunman's wrist turned slightly between breaths, and he fired 2 shots in succession with great precision and great prediction. The invisible trajectory of the bullets in the air was like an extremely precise network that sealed the space in front of the gunman. The gunman's heart, eyes cooperated with each other without any need for time. It was completely based on some kind of instinct formed by countless aiming shots. In just an instant, 3 shots were fired consecutively. Where the gunman's eyes aimed, the whistling bullets dragged the shadow of death as they shot towards the target. This kind of marksmanship was very good, very good. It had already reached a certain level, a level that made people want to slap the table and praise it. Since childhood, Sulu had been practicing those 10 postures tirelessly day and night. That was why he was able to turn the skills that the uncle taught him into an instinct of his body. When facing a strong opponent, he didn't need to think, and he could let his body instinctively choose the most suitable way to deal with the opponent, as well as the sharpest attack method and angle. This person was the same, but he used a gun. The situation was very dangerous. No matter how fast Su Li's movements were, even if he was about to turn into an afterimage, he was still not as fast as the shifting of his gaze. This was the so-called a glance of 10,000 miles. What was terrifying was that this assassin was able to display this ability through his powerful spear skills. No matter how strong he was, after the muscles in his body were bundled together, his resistance was as hard as a rock. However, he could not resist the bullets fired from such a large-caliber pistol. He was walking on the road to becoming the best machine, but he could never really become an ice-cold alloy machine. 3 clear and continuous gunshots rang out at the same time, 1 shot into the wood, 1 shot into the sky. The sound was like the blood cry of a cold bird, the sound was heart-wrenching and tear-jerking. The last bullet seemed to be fired in a scattered manner, but it was the most sinister and terrifying. Sulu let out a muffled groan. Relying on the enormous strength in his body, his ankle moved horizontally, his body forcefully falling to the right, a bright flower of blood spurting out from his shoulder. His knee fiercely smashed into the ground, and a burst of heart-wrenching pain suppressed the pain in his shoulder. Su Li's face suddenly paled, and his eyes suddenly lit up. Before the pain could completely appear in his brain, and while the flower of blood was still spurting out from his shoulder, he once again rushed up. The seemingly thin young officer's body actually contained a terrifying amount of strength. There was a burst of extremely strange high-frequency trembling, and the military uniform on his body rustled. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, he used the vibration between his knee and the hard mountain rock to bounce up and once again pounce toward the gunman. The knuckles in his right fist slightly protruded, transforming into a stream of light that smashed toward the other's earlobe. At this distance, this gunman with astonishing marksmanship once again opened fire. Sulu would not be able to dodge, but the gunman certainly would not be able to dodge Su Li's punch that contained the power to kill. It seemed like a method of ending in the same end, a method of fighting to be the first to face off on a narrow path, but in reality, Sulu had already calculated the result in his heart. It was impossible for the gunman's gun barrel to aim at his head in this instant. Being shot in the body, as long as it was not the heart. Sulu believed that with his monstrous body, tenacious life force, and bullshit luck that was like the last spaceship of the catastrophe, he should not die like this. Furthermore, the other party had received his punch. No matter how valiant the gunman was, he could only end up with his head exploding like a watermelon, dying on the spot. Therefore, this was not a mutual destruction, but using his own heavy injuries to exchange for the other's life. Sulu had to do this in order to force the other party to have the intention to retreat. There was a gap in the gunshot because he had a feeling that although this gunman was a professional, he did not seem to be the type of professional assassin who was unafraid of death under the glory of the charter. It had to be known that in a social environment like the Federation, the business of assassination could only be done once. And the other party seemed to have some kind of wild ambition to survive from the very beginning. If he wanted to live, this gunman had to retreat. Sulu firmly believed that at this moment, if the other party hurriedly withdrew his gun, he would definitely be able to keep him. However, he did not expect that the gunman would withdraw his gun earlier than he expected. At the same time the third shot was fired. The moment Sulu erupted, the gunman let out a muffled groan, allowing the pistol to slip from his wide palm. He turned around and left. This was because his wrist had been pierced by a small knife that had flown from outer space. Blood gradually flowed out, making the small knife look even more delicate. Because of this sudden change, the time the gunman abandoned his gun and turned around to leave was an instant ahead of Suli's prediction. So, when he attacked with the wind, he only had time to use the right side of his trembling body to touch the side of the gunman's body. However, Suli's full-powered strike, even though it only brushed past the gunman, still gushed out with a huge force. With a few cracking sounds, it broke one of the gunman's ribs. Under the shadow of the hat, the gunman's face was still completely covered. His lower jaw was deathly white. However, even though he had suffered such a heavy injury, he only let out a muffled grunt before falling silent. Instead, he valiantly borrowed Suli's force to increase his pace as he ran toward the autumn forest. In front of the autumn forest, he encountered a delicate man. The delicate blade flashed twice by the autumn forest, and a fierce collision sound rang out. The gunman's thigh had been pierced by the delicate man's military knife, but in the end, he still bravely charged into the autumn forest. On the fallen leaves, the bloodstains suddenly disappeared. No one knew where they had gone. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked into the depths of the forest. He turned back to look at Bayulan, whose right hand was trembling slightly. His heart was filled with infinite shock. This gunman not only had terrifying marksmanship, he was also so fierce in close combat. Sulu knew very well how dangerous Bayulan was. Those souls that had died under Bayulan's delicate knife were even more clear. Sulu also knew the lethality of his own body. In just a few breaths' time, the gunman had been heavily injured by Suli's headbutt, and had also been injured by Bayulan's treacherous sneak attack. Even so, the gunman had still managed to escape. He won't be able to escape from the Wood Valley. Bayulan lowered her head. Her pale face gradually recovered as she spoke softly. With such a heavy injury, can he still disguise himself as a normal person and walk out? Sulu didn't ask the delicate man beside him how long he had been following him. Perhaps after Bayulan was discharged from the hospital, he had been secretly responsible for his safety. Many things had happened in the past, so he let them go with the knife in his back, today's delicate knife. Normal people can't, but this person definitely can. Bayulan's slightly wet black hair fell between her brows. He had thrown out a life-saving knife, which had pierced through the gunman's wrist, and then used a military knife to stab the gunman's thigh. It was just a short exchange, but it had already exhausted his mental and physical strength. Unfortunately, the last stab had brushed past the gunman's aorta. The delicate knife and military knife had both pierced the gunman's body, but the gunman had still managed to escape. Bayulan's eyes drooped slightly. Looking at her empty hands, a faint sense of loss arose in her heart. The gunshot had alarmed many people. How could Sulu be worried about little Watermelon's safety? He knew that the Lin family would definitely not allow such a thing to happen. At this time, he didn't know how many people were looking for the gunman. Thinking of the gunman's extremely sharp and stunning 3 shots, as well as his valiant close combat escape ability, even he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Professional but not professional, tenacious but silent, Sulu and Bayulan looked at each other. They could see the shock and doubt in each other's eyes. Both of them thought at the same time that only the military could cultivate such a terrifying person. Today, Wood Valley was filled with distinguished guests. The Lin family, the Leaf family, the Nan family, the Federation's 7 great families that rarely appeared in public. 3 of them had actually chosen this place as their first choice for a holiday. It was precisely because of this that even though there was a shocking shooting in the manor, there was still no police report. The people in the 3 courtyards waited silently and calmly. The Lin family's security team, on the other hand, began to search the entire manor with ashen faces. Who dares to kill you? Who can hurt you? Li Xiaodong's gloomy face had already turned into shock. He stared at the wound on Su Li's shoulder and said in a deep voice. Today, Su Lo was personally chosen by the old man, and the federal military focused on training him. Although he had a close relationship with the old man, if something happened to Su Lo today, it would be very difficult for him to explain to the Federation. The men from Group 7 had the same expression as him. They had directly received the military order from the Ministry of Defense to protect Su Lo. In the end, Su Lo had been shot right under their noses and had almost been in big trouble. That is an amazing master. Not only is his marksmanship good, but his skills are also very good. Su Lo was very serious and did not exaggerate his evaluation of the gunman. Hearing the words marksmanship good, Xiong Linquan narrowed his eyes and revealed a trace of coldness. However, because of the words of the delicate man behind him, it turned into shock. Bai Yulan, who was leaning against the wall, whispered softly, "That person's marksmanship is much better than Xiong Zi's." Su Lu glanced at Brother Zhang, who had finally appeared behind Li Xiaotong, and said, "That person's close combat skills should be only a little worse than Brother Zhang's." Li Xiaodong's expression finally changed. He said faintly, "The Federation strictly controls firearms. Although there are definitely some on the black market, generally, people on the black market are not willing to sell to killers. The killers in the Federation are all one-off transactions. Therefore, they are not willing to let the government investigate them. I think that the gun you got should be from the front line of the West Woods. It might even be an Empire product. Don't expect to find anything like this. If he really can escape from Wood Valley at this time, unless we immediately apply to the Bureau of Proclamation, no one will be able to find the mastermind if he escapes to Bermuda." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.